I rented a cabin in the mountains of Idaho last October. I'd been working nonstop for almost a year, and I wanted to get away from everything. No calls, no meetings, no traffic. I picked a spot that was isolated, about 20 miles from the nearest town. The pictures online showed a quiet wooden cabin, small but cozy, with a wood stove and a porch that looked out over miles of forest. It looked like the kind of place where time would slow down. I drove up from Boise in a beat-up Ford that rattled on dirt roads. The deeper into the mountains I went, the worse the roads got. Trees closed in around the road like a tunnel. My cell service dropped off halfway through the drive. I passed maybe 2 or 3 houses on the last 15-mile stretch, but they were spread far apart, buried in trees. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe even better in person. It was surrounded by tall pines, with a narrow dirt driveway that circled around the back. The porch was solid and wide, with 2 chairs and an old propane grill. There was a pile of chopped wood stacked on the side, and I noticed the wood stove through the window as soon as I stepped onto the porch. It looked like the kind of place you could really hunker down and forget about the outside world. Inside, the cabin was simple. 1 main room, a small kitchen in the back, and a narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom and a bathroom. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just a radio and a few books on a shelf. It was clean, and it smelled like fresh pine and firewood. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I thought I'd love the silence, but I wasn't used to hearing absolutely nothing. No cars, no voices, no humming from appliances, just wind in the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin as it settled. I lit a fire in the stove, made some soup, and tried to read, but I kept looking out the window like I was expecting something. There was nothing but darkness out there. No lights, no stars, just pitch black forest. I went to bed early and slept lightly. Every time the wind pushed against the cabin, I opened my eyes. I told myself it would take a day or 2 to adjust. The second day was better. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and watched birds flit through the trees. I saw deer in the distance. I even walked a little trail that looped behind the cabin. It was narrow and the woods were thick, but it was peaceful. I started to relax. That night it rained. I was reading when I heard the first patter of drops on the roof. Then it turned into a steady downpour. I put more wood on the fire and went to bed early again. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. It was completely silent. The rain had stopped. I don't know what woke me, but I sat up and listened. For a minute, I thought I heard a thud, not like something falling, more like a footstep on the porch. I sat still, heart pounding. I told myself it was probably a branch or an animal, but I got up anyway. I looked out the window. Nothing. The porch was wet. Everything looked normal. Still, I stayed up another hour just listening. The third day, I was on edge. I didn't enjoy my coffee. I didn't read. I just kept looking out at the trees. I kept hearing little noises, rustling, cracking branches. I told myself it was animals, squirrels, maybe raccoons, but I stayed close to the cabin. That evening, I locked the door early. I shut all the curtains. I didn't even light the wood stove. I just wrapped myself in blankets and listened to the radio. Static, a few faint stations, nothing clear. Around midnight, I heard it again. A step. This time I was sure. I didn't move. I just held my breath. Another step, closer to the door. Then nothing. I wanted to look out, but I couldn't bring myself to pull the curtain back. I waited, maybe 20 minutes. Then I crept to the window. There was no one there, but something was different. The chair on the porch was turned. Not knocked over, just turned slightly, like someone had sat in it and stood up. The next morning, I looked for tracks. The rain had left the ground soft. I saw what could have been footprints, but they were faint. Not enough to tell much. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to leave. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal moved the chair. Maybe I was letting the isolation get to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I made it through the 4th day. I didn't go outside. I stayed in the cabin with the door locked. I started keeping a knife nearby just in case. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the chair by the window with the knife on my lap, waiting. It wasn't until dawn that I saw him, He was standing between the trees, maybe 30 yards out, not moving, just watching. I saw the shape before I saw the details. He was wearing a dark jacket, jeans, no hat. His face was pale. His eyes were fixed on the cabin. He didn't move. I stayed frozen, couldn't breathe. Then he turned and walked back into the woods. I stayed another day. I don't know why. I think I was too afraid to leave. Like going outside would make it worse. I stayed locked in, knife in hand, eyes on the window. He didn't come back, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I packed my things. I left the firewood. I didn't clean up. I just got in the car and drove. When I got to town, I found a gas station and filled up. The woman inside asked if I was coming from up the mountain. I nodded. She looked at me for a long second, then said something about hunters passing through and to be careful. I didn't respond. I drove straight home. When I got back, I locked all the doors. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't go back to work right away. I just stayed home. Weeks passed. I kept checking the news. Nothing came up. No crimes. No missing persons. Nothing about someone in the woods. I started to think maybe he was just a hunter. Maybe he was lost. Maybe he saw the cabin and thought it was empty. But deep down, I knew he wasn't lost. He stood there too long. He looked at me like he knew I was watching. He moved the chair. He walked around at night. I never went back to the mountains. I deleted the rental listing. I changed my phone number. I moved apartments. And sometimes, late at night, I still wake up and look at the window, expecting to see a figure standing there. But I never do. And that's the part that scares me most. Because if he ever really wanted to get inside, he could have. But he didn't. He just watched. I don't usually talk about what happened that weekend. I've told parts of it to close friends, but never the full story. Not because it's supernatural or anything like that. It wasn't ghosts or demons. It was real. It was people. And it was one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had in my life. It started when I decided to take a short break from work and head up to a cabin that belonged to a friend of mine. It was late September, the air was starting to get colder, and the leaves had just begun changing. I thought a few days out in the quiet would help clear my head. My job had been overwhelming lately, and I hadn't been sleeping well. The cabin was in a pretty remote area in northern Michigan, not far from the edge of a forest preserve. No neighbors close by, no phone signal, just a radio in case of emergencies. The place itself was small, just a single-floor wooden cabin with a little front porch and a wood-burning stove inside. There was a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room. No internet, no TV, just books, a deck of cards, and a few old board games in a closet. It was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. I drove up on a Thursday morning, arriving a little after noon. The drive was peaceful. Once I got past the last town, it was all dirt roads and tall pine trees. I pulled up to the cabin, unlocked it with the key my friend had mailed me, and brought in my things. A cooler with food, a sleeping bag, flashlight, some batteries, and a few other basics. I planned to stay until Sunday afternoon. That first day was uneventful. I unpacked, made a sandwich, then walked around the property. The woods came in pretty close behind the cabin, with a narrow trail leading off into the trees. I followed it for about a quarter mile before it split off into two other trails, both of which looked pretty overgrown. I turned back and spent the evening reading and sipping some cheap whiskey I'd brought with me. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the old wooden frame settling. It took a while, but I eventually passed out and didn't wake up until the sun was coming up through the small window beside the bed. The next day, Friday, was cold and cloudy. I spent most of it chopping some firewood, exploring the area around the cabin, and reading. Around 3 in the afternoon, while I was walking near the trail again, I thought I saw something move deeper in the woods. It was quick, like a flicker of movement between the trees. I froze and stared but didn't see anything after that. Probably a deer, I told myself, or maybe just a bird flying low. I walked back and didn't think much of it. Later that night, around 10 p.m., I was sitting on the porch with a blanket wrapped around me, just staring into the woods. I wasn't scared at this point, just relaxed. The whiskey helped. Then I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a crack, like a twig snapping somewhere in the dark trees. I sat up straighter and listened. A minute passed. Nothing else. Probably an animal, I thought again. I went inside and locked the door, just to be safe. I made sure all the windows were closed and latched. Then I went to bed. That night, I woke up to a noise. This time it was closer. It sounded like a soft thump, maybe 10 feet outside the window. Then another thump. I held my breath and listened. After a few seconds, it stopped. I sat there in the dark, frozen. I didn't have a weapon on me, just a pocket knife in the drawer next to the bed. I grabbed it just in case. I stayed awake for a while, staring at the ceiling and listening. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. Saturday morning, I felt uneasy. I tried to shake it off, telling myself again that it was probably just an animal. I made some coffee and sat on the porch again. The woods looked the same as always, calm and still. But when I walked around to the back of the cabin, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. Human footprints. They were faint, but definitely there in the soft dirt behind the house. I hadn't walked back there at all. They weren't mine, and they led from the edge of the woods up to the back window, and then back again. I felt sick. I walked back inside and locked everything up again. I took the radio off the shelf and checked the batteries. It was working. I didn't call for help yet, though. I didn't want to overreact. I still thought maybe a hiker or hunter had gotten lost and wandered too close. But it didn't explain why they came right up to the window in the middle of the night. I kept the knife in my pocket the rest of the day. I stayed inside and kept checking the windows. I even pulled the curtains shut. Couldn't relax. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing down on me. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay on top of the sleeping bag, fully dressed, with the knife beside me and the flashlight in my hand. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. I heard footsteps, light ones like someone trying not to be heard. They moved slowly around the cabin. Then they stopped. I held my breath and didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then I heard the doorknob rattle. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Someone was testing the door. I stood up slowly and tiptoed to the door, trying not to make any noise. I peeked through the peephole, but it was too dark outside to see anything. I backed away and waited. Whoever it was didn't try to break in. After a minute, the sound stopped. I didn't hear footsteps walking away. It was just silent. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting in the corner with the flashlight on and the knife in my hand. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see a face or a shadow, but nothing happened. At sunrise, I packed everything up. I was done. I didn't care if I had another day left. I needed to get out of there. When I stepped outside, the air felt heavy. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I loaded my stuff into the car and took one last look at the cabin. That's when I saw it. Carved into the wood of the porch railing, right where I had been sitting the night before, were 3 words, "I see you." I didn't wait. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached the town an hour away. I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. They sent a deputy out to the cabin later that day. He called me afterward to tell me what he found. There were more footprints, some old food wrappers behind the cabin, and a pile of firewood stacked neatly about 50 feet into the trees. Someone had been living out there, watching me. They never found the person, but I never went back. I didn't care if it was a drifter or some backwoods squatter. It didn't matter. That weekend taught me how vulnerable I really was. Now, even when I'm at home, I double-check the locks every night. I don't go camping alone anymore. I don't go anywhere too remote. And I never, ever ignore the sound of a twig snapping in the dark. I guess I should start by saying I don't usually do things like this. I'm not the kind of person who goes off the grid or disappears into the woods alone for a week. But after everything that happened last year, losing my job, the breakup, and my mom getting sick, I needed to step away, just for a bit. I thought being alone in nature would clear my head, help me reset. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want noise or distractions. I wanted trees, wind, and silence. That's how I found myself at this old, remote logging cabin in the middle of northern Washington. A friend of a friend owned the land, and the cabin had been used decades ago when the logging industry was big in the region. They let me borrow it for a week. I didn't ask many questions. I just got the directions, packed up my gear, and drove north. The drive from Seattle took almost 5 hours. The last hour was spent creeping down a narrow, muddy dirt road full of potholes and fallen branches. I lost cell service about 30 minutes before I got there. Once I arrived, I killed the engine and just sat in the car for a minute, looking at the cabin. It wasn't huge, just one story with a sagging roof, gray wood, and a small deck in front that looked like it might collapse if you jumped on it. The door was slightly crooked, and a pair of old deer antlers hung above it. Trees surrounded the cabin so closely that it barely got any light, even during the day. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of moss, pine, and old wood. There were no other cabins or houses around. It was complete isolation. I brought in my supplies: canned food, water jugs, sleeping bag, a small propane stove, a camp lantern, and a solar charger for my flashlight and GPS. There was no electricity or plumbing, just an outhouse behind the cabin and a small wood-burning stove in the corner. The place creaked every time I stepped. Dust coated the windows. There were cobwebs in the rafters. Still, I settled in. I told myself it was perfect. No one around, no cell phones buzzing, no pressure to do anything but rest. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, swept the floor, and went for a short walk around the property. The woods were thick, with ferns and moss crawling up the trunks of the trees. I saw old logging tools leaning against a tree stump, rusted saws and metal wedges. Everything felt still, like time had stopped here decades ago. That night, I made a small fire in the stove and heated up a can of soup. It was cold out, maybe in the low 40s, and the dampness made it worse. I bundled into my sleeping bag on the wooden cot near the stove and listened to the wind brushing against the cabin. I heard the occasional thump of a branch falling in the woods. Normal sounds. I told myself that over and over, but something didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the fact that I was so far from anyone, or maybe it was how quiet it was, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't sleep much that first night. The second day, I hiked a little farther, followed a barely visible trail that wound through the trees behind the cabin. It led to an old clearing where I found what looked like a collapsed storage shed. The roof was caved in, and broken crates were scattered around. Inside one of them were empty glass bottles and rusted food cans. When I stepped inside, I got this weird feeling, like I was being watched. I know that sounds dramatic, but it felt like something was just off. I turned around several times but didn't see anything. No animals, no movement. Still, I left pretty quickly and made my way back to the cabin before the sun dipped too low. That night, I lit the lantern and sat on the edge of the cot, writing in my notebook. Just as I was about to turn in, I heard something outside. It wasn't the wind or a branch. It was a sharp sound like something snapping. A twig came from right outside the cabin. I froze, lantern flickering behind me. I waited. Nothing. I convinced myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, and I got into my sleeping bag. But I didn't sleep. I kept hearing things, light scuffling sounds, something brushing against the cabin wall. I held my flashlight tight in one hand, staring at the door for hours. Eventually, I must have drifted off, because I woke up to sunlight pouring through the dusty window. I checked outside. There were no tracks. The dirt was soft from the rain, but I didn't see prints. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just letting my nerves get to me. But that day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't hike. I chopped some wood from the small pile beside the cabin and tried to fix one of the shutters that kept swinging in the wind. I cooked, cleaned a bit, and sat on the porch for a while watching the trees. That evening, just as the sun was setting, I saw something strange through the trees. Far off, maybe 50 yards out, it looked like someone standing still behind the trees. Just a shape. tall, maybe wearing a dark jacket. I squinted, but it was already getting dark, and the trees made it hard to see clearly. When I looked again, it was gone. I went inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep at all that night. I kept hearing the same noises, something walking around the cabin. At one point, I thought I heard the sound of the deck creaking, like someone stepping on it lightly. In the morning, I found something that shook me, a single footprint, human. It was in the mud by the steps, barefoot. I just stared at it for a long time. It wasn't mine. I wore hiking boots the entire time, and it was way too big for me anyway. My skin felt cold. I started to feel that maybe I wasn't alone out there. I thought about leaving. I really did. But the car was a mile down the trail, and I would have had to hike through the woods, alone, knowing someone was possibly nearby. I wasn't sure what was safer, staying in the cabin or making the trek back. I told myself I could handle one more night, and then I'd pack up in the morning and leave first thing. I barely moved that day. I kept my hatchet near me. I watched the woods constantly. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want anyone knowing I was in there. It got cold. So cold I could see my breath, and I shivered under the sleeping bag. I kept my flashlight on low and listened. Around midnight, I heard something that made my stomach turn. The sound of the door handle turning. Just once. A light jiggle. Then stillness. I stayed frozen, heart racing, holding my breath. Then, the sound of someone stepping off the porch, very slow, careful footsteps moving away. I didn't sleep at all. I just waited for the sun. When it finally got light out, I opened the door and checked. There were 2 more footprints now, bare feet again. One right in front of the door, and another halfway down the steps. I knew I had to leave. I packed everything in under 10 minutes, grabbed the hatchet, and started walking fast down the trail to where I left the car. When I got to the car, I nearly dropped my keys. There were handprints on the windows. Greasy, smudged handprints. Not from me. Someone had been there. I unlocked the car, threw everything in, and drove without even checking the mirrors. My hands were shaking the entire drive back down the muddy road. When I finally got to the main road and back into cell service, I pulled over and sat for a long time before calling the local sheriff's office. I gave them the location, told them what I'd seen, and about the footprints and the handprints. They said they'd send someone to check it out, but that area was huge and remote, and it could have been a transient or an old squatter. They thanked me and took my name, but didn't seem too concerned. I never went back. I found out later that years ago, before the cabin was abandoned, a logger went missing up there. Some people say he walked off into the woods and never came back. Others think someone else was living up there. Someone who didn't want to be found. I don't know who was out there, but I know what I saw. The footprints, the person in the trees, the handprints. I still think about it sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night. I picture that door handle turning, slow and quiet, like whoever was out there didn't want to break in. They wanted to test if I'd locked it. I did, and that might have saved my life. I drove up the winding gravel road just after noon, the old map crinkling on the passenger seat. The forest on either side towered above me, birch and pine so dense I felt boxed in. Every twist in the road brought me deeper into the wilderness, and I watched the trees shift through the windshield, sometimes close enough to fog the glass. I was alone, hauling a duffel full of gear for a long weekend in the woods. My life in the city got too crowded, too loud, so I booked a small cabin my friend told me about. A place with no phone signal, no electricity except a generator, and enough isolation to think. The cabin appeared in a clearing as the road ended. It was older than I expected. Rough-hewn logs darkened by decades of weather, windows clouded and moss clinging to the roof. A narrow porch ran across the front, with 2 chairs leaning at odd angles. A woodpile sat stacked under an overhang. The place was small, 1-story, maybe 600 square feet inside. No fancy comforts, but I'd planned for that. I parked and stepped out, breathing in the cold, sharp air that smelled of dust and wood. No wind, no birds, just the faint drip of melting snow off the roof. I grabbed my duffel and trudged to the wooden porch. My boots sank slightly on that moss. I noticed the lock on the door was old and rusted. I used the key I'd been given and pushed it open. Inside, it was dim. Canvas curtains hung across the windows, soaked yellow. A small kitchen to my left, a wood stove at center, and a table with 2 chairs. To the right, a narrow hallway led to a bedroom and bathroom. A musty smell hung heavy, a mix of damp wood, old fabric, and maybe mothballs. I dropped my bag and turned on the generator. The engine choked and coughed, then rumbled to life. Lights flickered inside. That relieved me. The hours of gathering my gear and driving felt worth it once I saw the cozy little cabin light up. I spent the next 2 hours unpacking and setting up. I stacked split logs by the stove, hauled a bucket of water from the pump outside, and lit a fire. The wood crackled to life, spilling warmth into the main room. I opened a beer and sat in one of the chairs by the stove, watching the flames. The cabin was quiet. So quiet my ears adjusted and I began to hear small sounds. The tick of the stove settling, distant creaks in the wood, the low hum of the generator running in the corner. I ate a simple pasta dinner, then stepped outside with my cup of tea. Sun had dropped behind the trees, leaving the clearing in early twilight. I studied the forest's edge, bare branches and dark shapes. A blackbird called once, far off, but that was it. No breeze, no rustle. I walked a few paces from the porch. The ground was firm underfoot, sprinkled with leaves. I wanted to feel truly away from it all. I looked back at the cabin. Lit windows, smoke curling from the stovepipe. Felt safe, like a little beacon in the woods. Then the night set in. The sky turned navy and stars appeared, though obscured in patches by clouds. Inside, I read by lamplight, then slept deeply in the small bedroom. The next day passed in a blur of hikes, hot coffee, and half-read pages. But by evening, something changed. 2. The second night, the generator sputtered at dusk. I realized my diesel fuel was low. I'd forget to refill the spare that morning. As the light dimmed, I walked to the storage shed beside the cabin, where an old jerrycan sat. I siphoned what was left. My hands shook slightly, cold and nerves combined. As I bent over the can, I heard a soft thump behind me, like a branch falling or a deer stepping on twigs. I'd been alone so long I noticed every shift in the silence. I looked over my shoulder. Tall pines lined the clearing. Nothing moved. No deer. The thump again, soft. Behind me, off to the right. No wind. I froze, heart hammering. I told myself it was natural, maybe a bird or wood shifting. I finished with the can, refueled the generator, and walked back, trying not to look behind me. Later, I sat by the fire, tension coiling in my chest. Out the window, shadows moved, branches casting long arms. I convinced myself it was fine. The full moon rose, hidden behind clouds. I stared at the forest's edge. After midnight, I felt eyes on me. I scanned the window pane, but all I saw was my reflection and the forest. I slept fitfully. I woke around 3 to a soft noise. A scrape, low and slow, like metal on wood. I sat straight up in bed, heart racing. Quiet again. I lay back, staring at the ceiling. The scrape returned, and again. I realized it was coming from the front door area, the door on the porch. I listened, paralyzed. The sound repeated, once more, slow, then silence. My pulse thundered. I considered calling someone, but the cabin had no phone, and the generator's noise masked anything. I stayed in bed until dawn. 3. Morning felt surreal. The fire was cold. Dishes sat in the sink. Outside, the mist lay over the grass. I brewed coffee and stared at the edge of the forest. What had made that noise? I thought I'd seen something too. When I woke, my mind raced. I tried to rationalize. Animals, branches, shifting cabin material settling. I refueled the wood stove and brought fresh logs in. On impulse, I walked around the cabin perimeter. The earth was soft from last week's rain. I noticed footprints in the mud, just outside the porch, leading a few feet then stopping. They looked like boots. They came from the woods, approached to within 6 feet of the porch, then vanished. My heart sank. I took pictures on my phone, zooming in. The prints were boot tread, deep in the mud. Someone had walked right up to the cabin. I backed off, breathing hard. I walked back in and slammed the door. I locked it. I set the generator on high, then picked up a heavy hatchet. I paced inside, glancing out each window. The day passed slowly. Every sound felt magnified. The dripping water, small twigs falling outside, the rumble of the generator. In mid-afternoon, I gathered courage and walked again. I followed part of the bootprint trail into the woods. They faded after 20 yards. I collected small sticks and rocks and brought them back. I heard snapping twigs behind me. Again, I spun around. Nothing. I raced back to the cabin. I barricaded the door with a log. I spent the rest of the day pacing, checking windows, watching the edge of the clearing. The generator died right after sunset. The cabin plunged into darkness except the fireplace. I kept the fire going and stayed awake until dawn. On the third day, I packed up. Enough. I planned to leave by morning. As I stacked gear, I heard thumps on the roof. I froze. Then again, sharp knocks spaced maybe 5 seconds apart. I ran outside, heart pounding. I looked up. The aged roof, no loose board. The cabin stood alone. Far as I could see, no footprints in the clearing. I scanned the forest. Dense. I stared at the treetops swaying. A chill moved through me, more than cold. I thought of thinking someone out there, maybe observing. I hollered, "Who's there?" My voice echoed. Nothing answered. No rustle. My mind filled with worst-case scenarios. I ran back inside, grabbed my duffel, and shoved everything in. That night, I didn't make a fire. I sat in the dark, generator off, listening. Leaves outside shifted. My mind raced. Was it someone pacing around outside? I felt small and vulnerable. I waited until midnight, then early, when light glimmered behind the curtains, I slipped out. I hitched everything to the car and drove the gravel road, headlights piercing the dark. I didn't look back. I got home by dawn. I slept through the day. The next morning, I looked at the photos of footprints. I zoomed and adjusted the contrast. It was clear. A military-style tread, wide sole. Maybe a hunter, not a stranger's sneaker. I checked local forums for any news. Nothing about recent break-ins or missing people. I filed it away. For weeks, I couldn't shake it. 3 weeks later, I felt drawn back. I stopped by a sporting goods store and picked up trail cameras. 2 small battery-operated units. I figured if I returned, maybe I'd discover what had been there. I drove up again last weekend. Rain slicked the road. Parked, heart pounding but calmer. I hiked out with both cameras, placed them discreetly facing the porch and near the footprint area. I stayed the night in my car beside the clearing. I slept fitfully. At dawn, I retrieved them and hurried home. At night, I reviewed the footage. There it was. One camera caught a figure. Big, wearing a heavy coat and boots, quiet as a cat. The figure stepped into the frame, looked up at the cabin, then turned away and walked off. No face visible. Other clips showed a time-lapse of movement around the porch. I needed to get away from everything. Work had been slowly crushing me for months. My body felt heavy all the time, and I could barely think straight anymore. So when I found a cheap rental cabin deep in the northern woods of Maine, I booked it without overthinking. It wasn't the best-looking place online. Small, no Wi-Fi, just a basic bathroom and a single bed, but I didn't care. I just wanted silence, something far from people, away from the constant ringing of phones and email pings, something that would let me breathe again. I drove up early on a Friday morning. It took nearly 6 hours, most of it on winding 2-lane roads that twisted through dense pine forests. For the last 20 miles, my phone lost signal completely. The road became gravel, then narrowed into a single lane with barely enough room to pass. Trees leaned in from both sides like they were trying to swallow the road. I passed no other cars, no cabins, no houses, just trees, birds, and the occasional glimpse of a rusted hunting sign nailed to a trunk. Eventually, I found the place. It sat back from the road about 30 yards, with a gravel patch where I parked my car. The cabin was even smaller than I expected. A single window faced the front, with a porch barely big enough to hold a broken plastic chair. The wood was dark and weathered, probably hadn't seen a coat of stain in years. Creaked when I stepped onto the porch. The key had been left in a rusted metal box nailed to the wall, just like the owner said. I turned it in the lock and pushed open the door. The inside smelled like old wood and stale air. There was a narrow bed along one wall with a faded wool blanket folded neatly at the end. A small wooden table sat in the corner, scratched and worn. Beside it, a chair that looked like it would collapse if I sat wrong. The bathroom was just a door behind the bed. A toilet, a small sink, and a tiny shower stall with a curtain that stuck to you like plastic wrap. I didn't mind. I unpacked my bag, took out a couple books, some canned food, and a small cooler. I had no plans except to rest and maybe go for a hike. That first night was quiet. Too quiet, actually. No cars in the distance, no hum of power lines. Just the constant rustling of trees and the occasional snap of something moving through the woods. I wasn't scared, not yet. I figured it was just raccoons or maybe a deer. The woods always have a way of sounding more alive when you're alone in them. I went to sleep early, under a sky so dark I couldn't see my hand in front of my face without a flashlight. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound. It was faint but sharp, like two pieces of wood knocking together. I held my breath and listened. Nothing. Then, a minute later, the same knock again. I got out of bed and looked through the window, but it was pitch black. I clicked on my flashlight and shined it out, sweeping across the trees. Nothing moved. No shadows. No animals. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling or something small brushing against the porch. I locked the door just in case and went back to bed. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike. There was no marked trail, but the woods weren't too dense. I figured I'd just walk straight for an hour, then turn around. I packed a small backpack with water, some jerky, and a compass. I set out around 10 in the morning. The forest was beautiful. Tall trees blocked out the sun except for where it filtered in between the trunks. I stepped over fallen logs, listened to birds calling in the distance. I didn't see anyone, not a soul. No hunters, no hikers, not even old trash or footprints. That was the first time I really noticed how empty the place felt. About 2 hours in, I found something strange. It was a rope, old, frayed, green with mold, tied around a tree about shoulder high. It hung there like someone had once used it for something but then forgot it. Nearby, a rusty tin can sat half buried in leaves. I looked around but didn't see any sign of a camp or shelter. It was just those two things. I left them alone and kept walking for a bit longer, but the feeling of calm had started to shift into something else. Like I wasn't supposed to be there, like someone had been here before me, and maybe they didn't leave. I turned around and headed back to the cabin, walking faster this time. I didn't stop to look at anything. When I got back, the sky was starting to darken. The whole cabin looked smaller now, more fragile. I went inside, locked the door again, and made a quick dinner from one of my cans. As the night fell, the sounds outside seemed louder, more deliberate. Not just the wind anymore, but the occasional snap of a branch, the crunch of leaves. I stayed in bed with my flashlight in my hand, waiting to hear something I could explain. Sometime after midnight, I heard breathing. It was faint at first, barely louder than the wind, but it didn't move. It stayed in the same spot for what felt like a full minute, right outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't shine my light. I just stayed perfectly still, my heart thumping so hard I thought it would echo. Then it was gone, just like that. No footsteps, no running, just silence again. The next day, I didn't leave the cabin. I stayed inside, listening. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I looked again, it was just shadows. I kept the door locked, my flashlight nearby, and a heavy branch I found leaning next to the wall. It wasn't much, but it felt better to have something in my hand. I thought about leaving, but my car was parked down a long gravel path. If someone was out there watching me, I didn't want to give them the chance. That night was worse. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the door handle turn, just once. A slow rattle, not hard, not forced, just like someone was checking. Then nothing. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely blinking. When the sun finally came up, I walked out and checked. No footprints, no marks, but the doorknob had a smudge on it that wasn't there before. Like a handprint. Greasy, dirty. I packed my bag. I didn't care anymore. I needed to get out. I grabbed everything I had and ran to the car. When I turned the key, it took a second longer than usual to start. My heart dropped, but then it roared to life. I backed up so fast I nearly ran into a tree. I drove straight down that gravel path without stopping. About a mile down the road, I saw something that made my stomach twist. On the side of the road, barely visible in the trees, was another rope, just like the one I'd seen during the hike. Same height, same moldy green color, tied around a tree, swaying slightly in the wind. I didn't stop. When I finally got back to the nearest town, I pulled into a gas station and sat in the car for nearly half an hour before I could breathe normally. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What could I say? That I heard breathing? That someone touched my door? That I saw ropes in the woods? A few weeks later, I looked up the area out of curiosity. Nothing came up about disappearances or crimes. Just some old forums with locals talking about how hunters used to set up camps deep in those woods but stopped because of trespassers. One guy wrote that sometimes you find signs of people out there. Rope, cans, carvings, but nobody ever claims them. Nobody ever comes forward. I never went back. I didn't need to. I got what I came for. Silence, sure. But I also got the kind of clarity that only fear brings. The feeling that something was just barely keeping its distance. Something that wanted to remind me how easy it would be to vanish if I stepped too far into the trees. That cabin is still listed online. I checked once. Still cheap, still remote, still surrounded by woods that look calm in the daylight. But I know better now. Nothing out there is ever really empty. It was late October when I decided to get away for a while. Work had been overwhelming, and I felt like I hadn't had a break in months. I had some vacation days saved up and wanted to get out of the city. I found a small cabin rental online, tucked away in the upper woods of northern Michigan, near a place called Rosegate. The pictures showed a plain wooden cabin surrounded by dense trees, with no neighbors nearby. It looked perfect, quiet, simple, and isolated. I packed my truck with the essentials: food, water, warm clothes, some firewood, and a few basic tools. I brought a small generator just in case. The cabin had no internet or cell service. That was part of the reason I chose it. I wanted to disconnect. The drive took around 7 hours. Once I left the main roads, I drove for miles down narrow dirt paths that twisted through the forest. The trees grew thicker the further I went, and the sky dimmed earlier than expected under all the branches. It was near dark by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It looked like the pictures, only a little more weathered. A single story with a pitched roof, a small porch out front, and just one visible window. There was a shed off to the right, half covered in moss. I unpacked quickly and set up inside. The cabin was small, just one main room with a bed, a table, a chair, and a wood stove. There was a bathroom off to the back, and that was it. No frills. The first night was quiet. I sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket, sipping a can of beer while listening to the wind moving through the trees. There was a strange kind of silence out there, thick and heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. It was unsettling at first, but I told myself it was just the change from city noise. The second day, I hiked a little around the area. There were some deer trails nearby and a narrow stream a few hundred yards from the cabin. The place was peaceful. I spent most of the day reading and chopping wood. I noticed some odd claw marks on one of the trees not far from the cabin. They were old and weathered, likely from a bear. Still, I made a mental note to be careful. That night, I heard something outside around 2 in the morning. It was faint at first, like soft footsteps crunching in the leaves. I sat up in bed, not sure if I was dreaming. The sound came closer, stopping now and then. I stared out the window, but it was too dark to see anything. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or maybe a deer. After about 10 minutes, it stopped. I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. The ground was covered in leaves and pine needles, so there weren't any clear tracks. Still, I had the weird feeling that something had been near the cabin, watching. I shook it off. By the fourth day, I was settling into the routine. Mornings were cold but peaceful, and the afternoons were warm enough to hike. I started noticing things out of place. A piece of firewood I hadn't moved was lying on the porch. A few of the tools I kept beside the shed were scattered across the ground. I tried to reason it out. Maybe animals, or maybe I had forgotten moving them. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been around. That night, I brought the hatchet inside and kept it near the bed. I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time it was louder. A steady crunch of steps moving around the cabin. Then a dragging sound. I stayed still, my heart pounding. I didn't have a gun, just the hatchet and a hunting knife. I waited, holding my breath. The steps moved to the back of the cabin. I heard something lightly tap against the bathroom window. Then silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sky finally began to lighten, I got up and checked every inch of the cabin and the area around it. I found nothing. On the sixth day, I considered leaving early. Something felt off, like I was being watched. But I also told myself I was overthinking. Isolation can do strange things to your mind. I decided to stay one more night and leave the next morning. I cooked a big dinner, cleaned up early, and made sure everything was locked. I left the generator off to avoid noise and lit a few candles instead. It was dead quiet again, like the trees were closing in. I sat in bed with the hatchet and flashlight within reach. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to the sound of the door handle rattling. Not loud, but clear. Metal clicking softly. I froze. Then, slow footsteps moved across the porch. I heard the wooden boards creak under weight. A long pause, then a dragging sound again. It reminded me of something being pulled across the dirt. I stayed completely still. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The steps circled the cabin. Again and again. They stopped at the bathroom window. I didn't hear anything else for a long time. Then I heard breathing, just outside the wall, right behind my bed. Slow, shallow breaths. I couldn't move. Minutes passed. Then nothing. I waited until sunrise, every muscle in my body tight. When I finally opened the door and stepped outside, I saw something that made me sick. Beside the porch, something had been dragged. The dirt and pine needles were pulled back, like someone had moved a heavy sack or animal. There were also small, deliberate holes dug along the back wall of the cabin, like someone had been trying to look or listen through the foundation. I packed up everything in 10 minutes. I didn't even eat. I just threw everything into the truck and drove. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. A week later, I reported what happened to the rental company. They brushed it off, said maybe it was a bear or someone from town messing around. But I knew better. Bears don't try door handles, and people don't breathe like that. Out of curiosity, I looked up the area again. There wasn't much about Rosegate. No history, no news, not even a real town center. Just a few mentions on hiking forums warning people not to camp too deep into the woods there. A few said the place felt wrong, like someone was always just out of sight, watching. I haven't gone back to the woods since then. I still go camping sometimes, but always with friends, and never without a weapon. I think about that cabin more than I like to admit. I don't know who or what was out there with me that week, but I know this. If I had stayed one more night, I wouldn't have come back. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. After working long shifts for over a year with barely any breaks, I finally decided to take a full week off and head up to a cabin in northern Vermont. A friend of a friend owned it and said I could use it anytime. It was a small, older log cabin set deep in the forest, far away from any main roads or neighbors. Exactly what I wanted: peace, quiet, and total isolation. I drove up early on a Monday morning in late October. The weather had just started turning cold. The leaves had mostly fallen, leaving bare gray limbs stretching up into the cloudy sky. The road to the cabin turned to dirt about 20 miles from the nearest gas station, and my phone lost signal about 5 miles after that. I didn't mind. I wanted to unplug for the week. I brought food, water, batteries, a flashlight, books, and enough supplies to last me more than a week. I even brought extra fuel for the wood stove and generator just in case. The cabin itself was small but solid. It had a front porch, 2 rooms inside, and a small outhouse about 50 feet out back. There was a little wood-burning stove in the main room and a small bedroom with a cot and thick sleeping bag. Everything smelled of old pine, dust, and something faintly metallic. There was no electricity except from the small generator and no running water. I didn't mind the setup. It reminded me of camping trips from when I was younger, except I had a roof and a mattress this time. The first 2 days were great. I read, wrote in a journal, took walks through the woods, and slept like a rock. I'd never heard silence so complete. No traffic, no buzzing from power lines, no voices. Just wind through trees and the occasional rustle of a bird or squirrel. The generator worked fine, though I didn't use it much. I mostly cooked on the old stove and boiled water from the pump out front. Every few hours, I'd walk down to the little stream about a quarter mile from the cabin. The trail was narrow but visible, lined with ferns and damp leaves. It felt untouched, but on the 3rd night, something changed. I went to sleep like usual, reading by headlamp until my eyes got heavy. I turned off the lamp, bundled up in the sleeping bag, and drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was still dark. I hadn't heard anything specific, just this feeling that something was off. The kind of alertness that kicks in suddenly, like your body knows something before your mind does. I sat up slowly, listening. There was no wind outside, no rustling. That's what struck me. Everything had gone quiet. Too quiet. I got up and crept to the window. It was a thick old pane of glass, cloudy from age, but I could make out the tree-line and the dark stretch of clearing around the cabin. I didn't see anything. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, heart beating fast, not sure why I felt so uneasy. Finally, I climbed back into bed, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. The next morning, I found tracks in the clearing. Human footprints, barefoot, pressed into the damp leaves and mud. They circled the cabin in a wide arc and disappeared back into the trees. I stood there for a long time, looking at them. I hadn't taken off my boots at all during my stay outside, and these prints were larger than mine, spaced further apart. Someone had been out there, watching. I checked all the windows and doors. Everything was still locked, nothing broken. I walked the perimeter with my small hatchet in hand, heart pounding. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I ended up staying inside the rest of the day, only leaving to quickly use the outhouse. That night, I pushed the table against the front door and slept with the hatchet by the bed. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard something again. A soft creak from the front porch. I held my breath. Another creak. I sat up in bed, not moving, not even breathing. Then there was a light scraping sound, like nails or fingers brushing against the wood near the window. It stopped after a minute. I didn't move again until the sun came up. In the morning, I went outside with the hatchet. There were more tracks, this time closer, right up to the front porch. I followed them a little ways into the woods, maybe 30 feet, before they disappeared into harder ground. I couldn't see where they went. No clear direction, just gone. I didn't want to panic. Maybe it was a hunter, lost. Maybe someone from one of the distant cabins. But why barefoot? Why the silence? Why only at night? I decided I'd stay one more day, then head out early in the morning. I started packing my things just in case. I refilled the gas can and checked the tires on my truck. Everything looked fine. Still, I couldn't relax. Every noise in the woods made me jump. I didn't eat much that day, just sat near the window watching. That night, I didn't sleep. I turned the lamp off and lay in bed, eyes open, gripping the hatchet. I kept checking the window every 10 minutes. Around 2:30, I heard it again. First, the porch creaked, then a soft rustle just outside, then a knock. One single, soft knock on the front door. Not forceful, not rushed, just a slow knock. I stayed frozen. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't knock again. After a few minutes, I heard steps moving away. I waited until dawn before I dared to look outside. Nothing. No footprints this time. No broken windows. No sign of anything. But I wasn't going to wait for another night. I finished packing and got in the truck. The engine started, and I backed out quickly. The drive out took over an hour, winding through rough dirt roads and narrow turns. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I made it back to town just after noon. I pulled into a gas station, got signal back on my phone, and sat there for a while just collecting myself. I called the guy who owned the cabin and told him something weird had happened out there. He didn't seem surprised. Just told me some of the locals didn't like strangers in the woods and that they usually kept to themselves. I didn't go back. I didn't even collect the rest of my gear. I left it all there. That trip stuck with me. I kept thinking about those bare footprints. The knock, the silence. Whoever that was out there, they never tried to hurt me. But they wanted me to know they were there, that I wasn't alone. And they were watching. After that, I didn't camp alone again. I didn't rent isolated cabins. I liked having neighbors, even noisy ones. I still go on trips, but I stay where there's people nearby, where there's signal, where I can call for help if I need it. I didn't tell many people about what happened, but when I did, most just brushed it off. Said maybe it was a drifter or someone living off-grid. Maybe, but I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'm not going back there to find out more. That week taught me something. Nature isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it hides things, people, and sometimes those people are more dangerous than anything else. The woods didn't feel the same after that. They stopped being quiet. They started feeling empty, and that kind of silence is worse than noise. It means something's listening. It was mid-October when I decided to get away from everything for a while. I had been working nonstop, and things had been rough in my personal life too. I was mentally drained. The idea of going off the grid for a bit sounded like the perfect break I needed. I found a listing for a secluded cabin in the northern part of Michigan, far from town and buried deep in the forest. It was an older place, nothing fancy, but it had what I wanted: peace, quiet, and space to think. The drive up was long. The last hour was on narrow, winding dirt roads through thick woods. The trees were mostly bare, their remaining leaves in shades of red and brown scattered across the path. I didn't pass another car once I turned off the main road. It was already getting dark by the time I pulled up to the cabin. It sat back from the road, surrounded by tall trees that creaked in the wind. It looked like no one had stayed there in a long time. The wooden siding was worn, the roof slightly sagged, and there were patches of moss on the deck. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and dust, but it was warm. There was a fireplace in the main room, a small kitchen to the left, and a short hallway that led to a single bedroom and a bathroom. Everything was simple and old-fashioned. There was no TV, no internet, and barely any cell service. Just what I wanted. That first night, I made myself a quick dinner from the supplies I brought, lit a fire, and sat in the armchair with a book. Outside, the wind picked up and howled through the trees. Every now and then I'd hear a thump or crack as branches shifted. It was unsettling at first, but I told myself it was normal forest sounds. I fell asleep on the armchair and only woke up when the fire had died down and the cold crept in. I got up, went to bed, and didn't wake again until morning. The next few days were quiet. I spent my time walking around the forest, taking short hikes, and cooking simple meals. I didn't see any other people or even animals, really, just birds, squirrels, and the occasional rustle in the bushes. I started to feel more relaxed, more at ease. But on the fourth night, things began to feel off. I was outside gathering some extra firewood before the sun went down. I had wandered a little farther than usual, maybe a 10-minute walk from the cabin. I spotted a good fallen log and bent down to start breaking it apart. That's when I got the feeling I wasn't alone. It was like being watched, and not in the casual way you feel when an animal looks at you. It was sharper, more deliberate. I froze and looked around. Nothing, just trees, quiet wind, and the fading light. I stood still for a while, waiting to hear footsteps or movement, but there was nothing. Eventually, I picked up the wood and headed back to the cabin. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole time. That night I couldn't sleep. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no branches swaying, not even any distant animal sounds. It was unnatural. I lay in bed for hours staring at the ceiling, my ears straining to hear something, anything. Around 2 a.m., I finally dozed off. Then came the thud. I snapped awake, heart pounding. It sounded like something hit the cabin. Not a small animal or falling branch, but something heavy. I sat up, listening. Another thud. This one closer, maybe against the side of the cabin. I crept out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand. I didn't have any weapons, just a long fire poker by the fireplace. I tiptoed into the main room. It was dark except for the low red glow of the dying fire. Another thud came from the side of the cabin. I slowly walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. Nothing, but then something moved. Just a shadow, quick and low to the ground, darting between trees. I stepped back and closed the curtain. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the chair with the fire poker in my lap, waiting. Nothing else happened. The next morning I went outside to look around. I half expected to find claw marks or footprints, but there was nothing. The side of the cabin looked normal. No damage, no tracks in the soft dirt. Maybe I imagined it, I told myself. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. Maybe I was just sleep deprived. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I kept the fire going, kept the door locked, and only stepped outside when I had to. The air felt heavy. I didn't hear birds or insects. Everything was still. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to sleep off the paranoia. I kept the fire poker next to the bed. Around midnight, I heard movement on the porch. Slow, careful footsteps, not animal-like. It was deliberate. I held my breath and stayed still. The steps paused just outside the door. Then a soft creak, like someone testing the handle. I crept out of bed and grabbed the poker. The doorknob rattled once. I held my breath, then silence. I waited, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. After what felt like an hour, I looked out the window again. No one was there. The next morning, I saw footprints in the frost on the porch. They were human, barefoot. I measured them with my own shoe. They were slightly smaller than mine. Whoever it was had walked up to the door, stood there, and then turned around and walked back into the woods. I followed the prints to the edge of the trees, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I wanted to leave, but the idea of hiking out to the main road felt riskier than staying put. I still had food and water. I decided to wait it out one more night. I spent the day barricading the door with furniture. I nailed shut the windows from the inside using leftover firewood and a hammer I found under the sink. I kept the fire going and stayed awake. That night was quiet, too quiet. No footsteps, no knocks, nothing. I finally dozed off sometime near dawn. When I woke up, the front door was wide open. The chair I had wedged under the knob was toppled over. The nails on one of the windows had been pulled out. My backpack was missing from the corner of the room. It had my keys, phone, wallet, and flashlight inside. I searched the cabin top to bottom, shaking. Nothing else was gone. Nothing was broken. It was like someone had walked in, taken just what they wanted, and left. I ran out onto the porch, yelling into the woods. Nothing answered. No movement. No sign of anyone. I had no way to call for help. Couldn't drive out. My car keys were gone. I had no signal, and the nearest town was hours away by foot. I spent the next 2 days trapped in that cabin, too afraid to go outside. I kept the fireplace going, rationed my food, and barely slept. I kept the fire poker with me at all times. On the third morning, I heard an engine. It was faint, but unmistakable. I ran outside and waved my arms until I saw a green truck coming down the path. It was the owner of the cabin. He had come to check on the place. He said he hadn't rented it out in weeks and was surprised to find someone staying there. I told him what happened, and he looked pale. He said he didn't advertise the listing anymore and hadn't been contacted about a new renter. We checked the area together. About 50 yards behind the cabin, hidden in a dense patch of trees, we found what looked like a primitive shelter made of branches and plastic tarp. Inside were my backpack and some empty food wrappers. There were also old tools, bits of wire, and other random junk. Someone had been living there watching the cabin. Waiting, the owner called the sheriff. We waited at his truck until the deputies arrived. They combed the woods for hours but didn't find anyone. Whoever it was had vanished. They told me it wasn't the first time something like that happened in the area. People squatting in old hunting shelters, sometimes watching cabins for days before stealing from them. They took my statement and drove me to town. I stayed in a motel that night and got a ride home the next morning. I never went back to that cabin. I haven't gone camping or hiking alone since. I lock my doors every night, even if I live in the suburbs now. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear footsteps outside, but at least I got out. And whoever was out there, they didn't follow me home. Life had been weighing me down, and I needed some time away from the noise, the stress, the emails, the calls, the endless city traffic. I wanted something quiet, something off-grid. So I booked a small cabin deep in northern Montana, almost brushing the Canadian border. It was supposed to be isolated, surrounded by nothing but forest and snow. No Wi-Fi, no TV, no neighbors for miles. Just what I thought I needed. It was early February when I made the trip. I rented a Jeep with snow tires, stocked up with groceries, a few gallons of extra gas, batteries, a satellite phone, and even some bear spray, just in case. The owner of the cabin had emailed me simple instructions with GPS coordinates and a reminder to keep the wood stove going. He said there was a backup generator, but not to rely on it too much. His message ended with, *, stay safe. If anything happens, hike south until you hit the main road. *. The drive took me most of the day. The last 2 hours were the worst. Nothing but icy roads and thick pine forest. The snow was falling heavily by the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, almost like it had been dropped there from the sky. The place looked old but solid. A single-story wooden structure with a small porch, a tin chimney, and a snow-covered roof. The windows were frosted up, and the door creaked loudly when I opened it. Inside, it was cold and dark, but it smelled like dry wood and dust. There was a small kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, a bathroom with a composting toilet, and a bedroom in the back. Everything was simple but clean. A pile of firewood was stacked beside the stove, and a few kerosene lanterns were hanging from nails on the wall. I unpacked quickly, lit the stove, and boiled some water for tea. By nightfall, the cabin was warm, and I sat by the window, watching the snow come down in thick sheets. No sounds, no lights outside. Just the fire crackling and the wind brushing against the walls. That first night, I slept like a rock. The kind of sleep you only get when you're far away from everything. No cars, no sirens, no buzzing phones. The next few days passed quietly. I spent my time chopping wood, reading, cooking, and going for short hikes in the woods around the cabin. There was a frozen lake about half a mile north, and I'd sit by it bundled up in layers, just listening to the silence. It was peaceful. The isolation felt like medicine. It was exactly what I needed. On the 5th day, I woke up to a strange sound outside. Not loud, more like a soft thump. At first, I thought it was snow sliding off the roof, but then I heard it again. A slow, heavy sound, like something sinking or shifting in the snow. I got up, looked through the frosted window, but didn't see anything. Just the same forest, same endless white. I put on my boots and jacket, grabbed the small shovel I'd been using to clear the porch, and stepped outside. The air was brutally cold, and the snow had fallen almost a foot overnight. I walked around the cabin, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No tracks, no broken branches. Just that thick, heavy silence. As I circled back toward the front porch, I saw something that made me stop. About 20 feet from the cabin, near the edge of the trees, the snow looked different. It was sunken, like something heavy had been dropped there and then buried. I walked over slowly, crunching through the deep snow, and stopped a few feet from the spot. The depression in the snow was wide, about 6 feet across, and it looked fresh. Snow had been scooped or pushed back in a way that didn't look natural. I crouched down and touched it. The snow wasn't powdery like the rest. It had been packed by something. I used the shovel to dig a little. The top few inches were soft, but underneath that, it was dense and icy. I kept digging, and soon the edge of something solid started to show. It was dark, like plastic or rubber. I cleared more of it and saw what looked like a large black trash bag. A thick industrial one. Something about it made my stomach turn. I've seen enough crime shows to know what that usually means, and suddenly being out here alone didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt stupid, exposed. I stood there for a long moment just staring. I didn't want to know what was inside, but I also couldn't just walk away. I cleared more snow, enough to see that there were 2 bags. One was bigger than the other. Both were tied shut tightly. The cold seemed to bite deeper into my skin, or maybe it was nerves. I used the shovel to poke at the smaller bag. It didn't feel like garbage. It was firm, but with give. Not solid like metal or stone. Something softer. I dropped the shovel and stepped back. My heart was thumping in my chest. I couldn't ignore this. It felt wrong to touch it any further, like I'd be disturbing something I shouldn't. I ran back to the cabin, locked the door behind me, and turned off the stove, even though the cold started creeping back in. I took out the satellite phone and stared at it. I didn't want to call the police unless I was sure. What would I say? That I found some suspicious bags in the snow? That wasn't enough. I told myself I'd go back in the morning, dig them out completely, and then decide. But I didn't sleep that night. Every noise outside made my heart jump. I kept thinking about someone coming back for the bags, maybe realizing they weren't buried well enough. I stayed up by the stove with the lantern on, holding the fire poker like a weapon. When morning came, it was still snowing. I dressed and walked back to the spot with the shovel. To my surprise, the bags were gone. The snow had been disturbed again, not just from weather, but dug up. The pit was bigger now, and there were new tracks in the snow, long, wide dragging marks leading into the trees. Someone had taken them. I followed the trail for a few minutes, but the snowfall was already covering parts of it. It went deep into the woods, and I couldn't see where it ended. I didn't want to follow it far. I went back, locked myself inside again, and this time I called the police. It took almost 6 hours for them to reach me. 2 officers in a snow-capable SUV came around sunset. I showed them the spot. They took photos, looked around, and noted the drag marks. But there wasn't much else they could do in the dark. They told me they'd send a search team the next morning. They also asked if I wanted to be escorted out, but I said no. I don't know why. Maybe pride. Maybe I didn't want to feel like I was running away. Or maybe I still didn't really believe what was happening. That night, I stayed awake again. This time with the police SUV parked outside the cabin for a few hours. But they left around midnight and I was alone again. The cold seemed worse now, even with the fire going. I kept thinking about who had buried those bags, about who had come back for them, about whether they'd seen me. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside. Slow, careful ones. Not animals. Not wind. I didn't move. I just sat there with the fire poker in my hands, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped by the window, just outside the frosted glass. I didn't dare look. Then they moved away. No knocking, no voice, no noise after that. Just silence. When morning came, I found more tracks outside. Heavy boot prints circling the cabin. They didn't lead from anywhere. They didn't approach from a direction. It was like they just appeared a few feet from the porch and circled the place twice. Then nothing. The search team showed up around 9 a.m. 5 guys, all wearing snow gear and carrying radios. They combed the woods for hours, followed the drag marks deeper into the forest. They found pieces of the black bags torn on some branches about a mile in. Nothing else. No bodies. No other signs. They told me they'd let me know if they found anything, and they left. I packed my things that same day and drove out. I didn't look back. Weeks passed. I called the local police once. They said the case was open, but no new leads. They didn't find anything conclusive. No missing person reports that matched. No signs of who had been out there. I still don't know what I found in the snow. I don't know who came back for it, and I don't know why they came to the cabin that night. Maybe it was random. Maybe they saw my tracks leading to the pit and got scared. Or maybe they were checking to see how much I'd seen. I think about it every night now. I try to remember every sound, every footprint. I check the locks twice before bed. I keep a flashlight and a heavy wrench beside me. The cabin was supposed to be a place to escape, a quiet retreat, but it showed me something I wasn't meant to find, and I'll never go that far off the grid again. I was looking to disconnect for a while. Things back home had gotten loud. My job was pushing me to the edge, and I was starting to feel like I couldn't breathe in the city anymore. I needed silence. I needed something real. So I rented an old cabin I found listed through a lesser-known website. It was buried deep in the northern part of the state, surrounded by forest and nothing else. No cell signal, no internet. That was the whole point. The listing said it was an old logging cabin, last used by workers back in the 70s, but it had been cleaned up and made livable. The owner said he maintained it every summer. It looked rustic in the pictures but sturdy. Just a single-floor cabin with a pitched metal roof, a porch, and a chimney. The area looked remote. No nearby neighbors, and the road leading to it was just a dirt logging road cutting through thick forest. I packed up everything I'd need. Food for 10 days, bottled water, a large cooler with ice, basic first aid, a hunting knife, and a sidearm I kept more for peace of mind than anything else. I also brought firewood, a few books, and a notebook. I planned to do nothing but read, write, and sit with my thoughts. The drive took almost a full day. After 6 hours on the interstate, I turned off onto smaller roads, then gravel, and eventually a rough dirt track that used to be a logging road. I had to slow to a crawl to avoid damaging my car. The trees pressed close on either side. There were no signs or markers, but the directions the owner gave me were clear. Follow the logging road for 10 miles, pass a rusted-out bulldozer, then turn left onto a barely visible trail for another mile. The trail barely looked like a road, just 2 tire tracks with grass growing up the middle. When I finally saw the cabin, I was surprised at how intact it looked. It was made of dark wood, with the porch slightly tilted, but the windows were solid and the roof was good. The forest surrounded it in every direction. The air smelled like pine and wet moss. I turned off the car, stepped out, and immediately heard nothing. Not quiet, *nothing star. No cars, no people, not even birds at that moment. Just the wind through the trees. I unloaded my supplies and brought everything inside. The cabin was small. 1 main room with a cot, a wood stove, a small table, and shelves. There was a separate little room with a composting toilet and another with a makeshift shower fed by a rainwater barrel. The lights were powered by a single solar panel and a battery pack. No refrigerator, just a big old cooler. By the time I got everything set up, it was already evening. I lit a fire in the wood stove to take the chill out of the air. I sat on the porch as the sun went down, sipping coffee from my thermos and looking out into the trees. The quiet started to feel good, calming. That night I slept hard. No noise, no street lights, just complete darkness. I woke up once, around 2 a.m., because I thought I heard a crunch outside, like something stepping on dried leaves. I lay there for a while, holding my breath, but I didn't hear anything else. I chalked it up to a raccoon or deer and fell back asleep. The first few days were peaceful. I walked a bit each morning, staying close to the cabin, just exploring the area. The forest was beautiful, mostly pine and fir trees, with thick undergrowth in some parts. I saw animal tracks, a few deer, some kind of bird, maybe fox. I didn't go far, didn't want to get lost. I left markers along the trail when I did wander. In the evenings, I read or wrote. The cabin creaked sometimes at night, which was normal. Wood settles, especially when the temperature drops. The sounds didn't bother me, but the feeling I had on the 3rd night was different. That night, I was reading when I started feeling watched. It's hard to describe. It wasn't a sound. It wasn't even something I saw. Just this pressure, like something had changed. I got up and went outside, thinking maybe an animal was nearby. I stood on the porch, flashlight in hand, shining it through the trees. I didn't see anything. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I locked the door when I went back in, even though I hadn't bothered the first 2 nights. The next day, I found something odd during my morning walk. One of the trees about 50 yards from the cabin had fresh cuts in the bark, horizontal slices about chest high, like someone had dragged a knife across it several times. The marks looked recent. The bark still curled outward, and sap was dripping. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. It wasn't animal damage. It was deliberate. That day, I stayed closer to the cabin. I kept checking the tree through binoculars from the porch. Nothing moved out there, but I couldn't relax. That night, I left a flashlight on, pointing at the door. I kept the knife nearby. I barely slept. On day 5, I woke up to find something new. On the porch railing, where I had been resting my coffee mug the day before, there were more of those same slash marks. Smaller, shallower, but same pattern. Like someone had come up in the night and scraped the railing with a blade. I hadn't heard anything. I checked the area around the cabin but didn't find footprints. The dirt was packed tight from lack of rain. I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Could have been an animal, though it didn't look like it. Still, I wasn't ready to admit I was scared. I made coffee and forced myself to go on a longer walk that day to shake the unease. I followed the old logging road back the way I came, maybe a mile out, then turned around. On the way back, I saw another tree with the same cuts. This one was deeper, and there were more of them. They formed a ring around the trunk, maybe a foot wide. I touched the bark. Fresh again. I walked faster after that. That night, I didn't sleep much. Around 3 a.m., I heard the sound again, leaves crunching, then silence. I stayed in bed, holding my breath, hand on the grip of my sidearm. I heard nothing else for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found a small pile of rocks stacked on the edge of the porch steps. 7 of them balanced carefully. They weren't there the day before. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen or heard another person for 5 days, but someone had been close enough to touch the cabin while I slept. I checked everything. The car was untouched. The supplies were fine, but the sense of violation was strong. I didn't feel like I was alone anymore. I kept my pistol holstered the entire day. I walked in tight circles around the cabin, eyes scanning constantly. I didn't write. I didn't read. I didn't eat much either. That afternoon, I made the decision to leave the next day. I figured I could pack up early and be back on the interstate by noon. I didn't want to be there anymore. That night, everything went quiet again. Too quiet. No wind, no creaks, no animals, just stillness. I sat up most of the night with the fire going. Around 4 a.m., I thought I saw something in the trees, a shape, dark and low to the ground, maybe 100 feet away. But when I looked harder, it was gone. I couldn't even be sure it was there at all. I didn't sleep. At sunrise, I started packing. I moved quickly, loading everything into the car. I kept my pistol on me, constantly looking into the trees. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't make coffee. I just wanted to go. As I pulled away from the cabin, bumping down the overgrown trail, I looked back one last time. Nothing moved. Nothing followed. But about a mile out, where the logging road began, I noticed tire tracks in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were fresh, pointed toward the cabin. Someone else had driven out there, and recently, but they hadn't passed me, which meant they were either still in the woods, or they had left by some other route. My hands gripped the steering wheel harder as I drove. I didn't stop. Not once. Not even to pee. I kept going until I was back on the main road, back in range of a cell tower, back in the world of other people. Once I got home, I emailed the cabin owner and asked if anyone else was supposed to be on the property during my stay. He said no. He hadn't been out there since August. I didn't reply. I didn't want to talk about it. That was 6 months ago. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still think about that cabin sometimes, about the cuts in the trees, the rocks on the porch, the silent nights. I still wonder if I was being watched the whole time or just at the end. I wonder who made those marks and why, but I don't plan on finding out. I've learned what I needed to know. Not all places are meant to be alone in. Some stretches of forest look peaceful, but they hold things you don't want to understand, people who don't want to be found, and signs you're not supposed to see. I sleep with the lights on now, and I don't go looking for silence anymore. Some quiet is the wrong kind. I rented a small off-grid cabin in northern Idaho for 10 days last fall. I had been feeling burnt out from work, tired of city traffic and people everywhere. The idea was to spend some quiet time in the woods, away from emails and noise, maybe catch up on sleep, do some hiking, cook simple meals, and just be alone. I found the place online. It was advertised as secluded with no cell service, solar power, a wood stove, and a small creek out back. It looked perfect. The cabin was about 2 hours from the nearest town, and the last half hour of the drive was on a rutted dirt road. By the time I got there, the sun was starting to go down. The place looked even better in person, simple and weathered but solid. A single room with a bed, a small table, shelves with basic supplies, and a big wood stove. There was a detached outhouse and a fire pit out front. The surrounding woods were thick with pine and fir, and the air smelled clean and sharp. I unpacked my food and gear, brought in firewood from the stack on the porch, and settled in. The first couple of days were peaceful. I hiked a few miles out along some of the unmarked trails behind the cabin and found animal tracks, little streams, and piles of deadfall. I saw a moose on my second day, huge, brown, and silent, just standing off the trail before disappearing between the trees. At night, I read or wrote in my notebook, cooked over the wood stove, and sat outside listening to the wind. On the third night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a loud thump outside. I froze in bed, heart racing. I listened and heard nothing for a minute. Then, another thump, closer this time, maybe on the side of the cabin. I got out of bed slowly and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't have a gun, but I kept a hatchet near the door. I opened it just a crack and shined the light out. The woods looked normal. The firewood stack was undisturbed. No signs of anything. I waited a minute before closing the door again, locking it and going back to bed. It took me a while to fall asleep. The next morning, I found some fresh footprints in the dirt near the side of the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They looked like boot prints, medium-sized. They led from the woods to the side of the cabin and then disappeared in the brush again. I stood there for a long time just staring at them, trying to understand what I was looking at. No other cars had come down the road. I would have heard them. And who would be walking around here in the middle of the night? I told myself it could have been a hunter or a hiker passing through. Maybe someone who didn't realize the cabin was occupied. Still, it left me on edge. That day, I carried the hatchet everywhere. I didn't hike far, just stayed close and kept checking my surroundings. I thought about leaving early, but I didn't want to scare myself out of something I had looked forward to for months. That night, I bolted the door and pushed a chair under the handle. I kept the hatchet and flashlight by the bed. I barely slept. Every creak and gust of wind had me holding my breath. The next day, I saw something that made me pack my stuff. About 100 yards from the cabin, back behind a small rise, I found a makeshift camp. Just a blue tarp strung between trees, an old fire ring, and some trash. Cans, wrappers, a torn backpack. It looked abandoned, but not for long. There were fresh cigarette butts in the dirt. I didn't smoke. I hadn't seen any sign of recent people until now, and that tarp hadn't been there before. I felt watched, even though I didn't see anyone. I left everything where it was and walked back to the cabin fast. That afternoon, I packed my gear and cleaned up. I decided I'd leave first thing the next morning. I didn't want to drive the road in the dark. But that night turned out worse than anything before. It was around 1 a.m. when I heard something on the porch. Slow, heavy steps. Then the doorknob rattled. The bolt held, but the sound of someone trying it made my stomach twist. I stayed frozen in bed, barely breathing. Then came a long scrape on the wood siding, like something metal dragged across it. Then silence. I didn't dare move. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep from exhaustion. When I got up at dawn, I opened the door and found deep scuff marks along the siding and 2 cigarette butts near the steps. The boot prints were back too, clear and deliberate. They led in from the woods and stopped at the porch. No sign of them leaving. That was enough for me. I loaded the car and left within 10 minutes. On the way back down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting someone to step out of the trees. When I finally got to town, I stopped at a diner and just sat in the parking lot for a long time. My hands were still shaking. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what I'd even say. There was no real proof anyone did anything illegal. But I reported it to the rental site when I got home, just to warn others. The listing was taken down a few days later. I still think about those nights often. I wonder if someone had been living out there all along, watching. Or maybe someone just stumbled across me and decided to mess with me. Either way, I'm not going back to any remote cabins alone for a long time. It's not the woods I'm afraid of. It's the people hiding in them. I've been back in the city since then, back in traffic, back in the noise. But I still double-check my locks every night. I still sleep light. That trip gave me exactly what I asked for. Quiet, isolation, time alone. But it also showed me just how vulnerable that can feel, and how quickly peace can turn into fear when you're out there, alone, with no one coming to help if something goes wrong. I had been looking forward to staying at that cabin for months. It was a remote, private place deep in the Adirondacks, up in northern New York. The kind of place where the air feels untouched, where the snow falls harder and quieter, and where you don't hear another car or voice for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I needed to get away from everything: work, the city, people. I had a lot on my mind and a personal writing project I'd been meaning to finish for over a year. The cabin belonged to an old college friend of mine, Andrew. We hadn't spoken much in years, but when I reached out to ask about any quiet winter getaways, he offered his family's off-grid cabin for a few weeks. He told me it was rustic, no running water, no electricity besides a small generator, and no cell service for miles. It sat near a frozen lake, surrounded by forest. Perfect. I left early on a Tuesday morning in late January. My SUV was packed with everything I thought I'd need: canned food, propane tanks, water jugs, a small solar panel, backup batteries, heavy winter gear, a rifle, and more. I had enough supplies to last well over 2 weeks if needed. I even brought extra fuel and a satellite emergency beacon, just in case something went wrong. The drive took nearly 8 hours from the city, including the last 2 on snow-covered back roads that felt more like trails than anything else. The tires struggled, but I took it slow and managed. There were no tire tracks besides mine by the time I reached the turnoff. The road leading up to the cabin hadn't been plowed, so I parked at the bottom of a short ridge and hiked the last quarter mile on foot, dragging a sled behind me. It was colder than I expected, maybe 10 degrees, and the wind cut harder than I thought it would. The trees were stripped bare, their trunks frozen and unmoving. When I got my first full look at the cabin, I stopped and just took it in. It was small, maybe 30 feet wide and 20 deep, made from thick, dark logs. Smoke curled from a metal chimney. The lake was just beyond it, frozen flat and gray under the weight of winter. The only footprints in the snow were mine. I got the door unlocked and stepped inside. It was cold, dark, and quiet. The only furniture was a wood table, 2 chairs, a cot with thick wool blankets, and an old cast iron stove in the center. I could see my breath. I dropped my bags, filled the stove with wood, and lit it. The fire caught fast, and soon the crackling heat filled the place. I settled in quickly. The first night, I slept like a stone. The kind of sleep that comes when you're far away from everything and your body just shuts down. No traffic, no buzzing phones, no interruptions. Just the wind and the fire. The first few days were good. I woke early, wrote for hours, took walks on the frozen lake, gathered wood, ate simple meals, and read by lantern light. It felt like the days were longer out there, even though the sun set by 5. I got a lot done. The silence helped me focus. My thoughts were clearer. The cabin creaked sometimes, especially at night, but I told myself it was just the cold shifting the wood. By the 5th day, I noticed something that made me pause. It was just after breakfast. I had stepped outside to stretch and gather some snow to melt for water when I saw a line of faint tracks on the far side of the lake. At first, I assumed they were animal tracks, maybe a coyote or bobcat, but the shape was all wrong. The prints were deep, evenly spaced, and almost perfectly in line. They looked human, barefoot even. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't there the day before. I knew that for sure. The wind would have covered them overnight, especially with how fine and loose the snow had been blowing across the lake. That meant they were fresh, very fresh. I looked around the edge of the lake, but saw no one. I followed the prints for a few minutes. They didn't lead all the way across the lake, just about halfway, then stopped, like the person had come from the woods and stood there for a while before turning back, or just disappeared. I went back inside and locked the door for the first time since I arrived. That night, I slept lightly. Every crack of ice outside sounded louder. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the tracks bothered me. Who walks barefoot in sub-zero weather? Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone nearby knew I was here and wanted to mess with me. I kept telling myself that. But the next morning, I found more. This time, they were behind the cabin. Not leading up to the door, just off to the side, about 10 feet from the rear wall. Same shape, deep, bare, fresh. Something was wrong. I checked the door and windows, all untouched, no signs of entry, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That day, I didn't get any writing done. I kept pacing the cabin, looking out the windows, checking the stove, and listening. I took my rifle down from the wall, loaded it, and leaned it against the cot. That night, just before I fell asleep, I heard something. It was faint, almost like a breath, but slower. A steady exhale, then a crunch. Snow. Footsteps. I held my breath. It came from the side of the cabin, maybe 10 feet away, then stopped. No knock, no movement, just silence again. I sat there for an hour, rifle in hand, heart pounding, but nothing else happened. I finally fell asleep just before sunrise. When I went outside later that morning, I found more tracks, this time circling the entire cabin. I didn't know what to think. I kept asking myself, who the hell would be out here in this cold, walking barefoot in the snow? It made no sense. There were no nearby cabins, no roads, nothing. The nearest sign of life was over 2 miles away by snowmobile trail. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe something with oddly shaped paws. Maybe the snow warped the tracks, but I couldn't lie to myself anymore. They were human, and whoever was making them was watching me. I packed a few bags that day and loaded the sled. I wanted to leave. I tried to tell myself I was being irrational, but every part of me said to go. I knew I couldn't get the SUV up the ridge in the snow, but I could make the hike out and call someone once I had signal. Just before I left, I checked the cabin one more time. I made sure the fire was out and stepped onto the porch. The sled was gone. I looked down the ridge. Nothing, just white, no tracks. It was like someone had taken it and covered their steps behind them. Panicked, I ran down the slope, fell once, scrambled back up, and searched the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sound. I went back into the cabin, locked the door, and sat in the corner with the rifle. I stayed up the entire night. Every few minutes, I'd get up and peek through the windows. At some point around midnight, I saw a shape move across the far edge of the lake. Just a silhouette, no flashlight, just walking. I watched until it faded behind the trees. For 3 more days, I stayed inside. I rationed my food, melted snow for water, and kept the fire going low to avoid drawing attention. I saw the figure 2 more times. Once in the early morning, crouched near the treeline. The second time, late at night, standing about 30 feet from the cabin, still staring. I didn't sleep. I started hearing noises from the woods. Not footsteps anymore, but tapping. Sometimes on the trees, sometimes on the walls of the cabin, like someone was dragging something along the logs. Once, I thought I heard breathing outside the window, but I didn't go check. I was beginning to lose it. On the 10th day, the wind picked up again. A storm rolled in, and visibility dropped to almost 0. The trees howled. Snow battered the cabin like sand against glass. That night, I heard the tapping again. Then a bang. Not loud, but sharp. Wood on wood. I raised the rifle and aimed it at the door. I stayed like that for nearly 4 hours. Nothing came through. Nothing moved after that. But in the morning, I found something shoved under the door. It was a strip of leather, maybe from a boot. Tied around it was a piece of cloth, stained dark. I didn't open it. I threw it into the stove and watched it burn. I didn't know what else to do. I waited until the storm passed and packed everything I could carry. I loaded my rifle, slung it over my shoulder, and left just after dawn. I didn't use the trail. I went through the woods, moving slow, quiet, stopping every few minutes to listen. It took most of the day, but I finally got close enough to the road to get a signal on my emergency beacon. I didn't stop walking until I heard the sound of an engine. A rescue crew picked me up a few hours later. They asked questions. I told them I got lost, that my sled was stolen, that I panicked. I didn't mention the tracks. I didn't talk about the figure in the trees. I just wanted to go home. Back in the city, it took weeks before I could sleep a full night. I kept the lights on. I stopped writing. I stayed away from anything quiet. I couldn't stand silence anymore. About a month later, I got a call from Andrew. He told me someone had broken into the cabin after I left. When they went to check, they found the place torn apart. Furniture over. I was never really the kind of person to do things alone, but turning 30 had flipped a switch in me. I started feeling like I had been missing out on something, some kind of self-discovery or clarity that people always talked about after solo trips. I'd seen enough Instagram posts of people in hammocks or sitting by quiet lakes, wrapped in flannel, looking like they had finally figured out life. I wanted a taste of that. I wanted to get away from the noise of work, traffic, and my phone always buzzing. So I rented a cabin. I found it through a listing on a small website that catered to off-the-grid travelers. The description was vague, but the photos sold it. A small wooden cabin sitting alone by a lake, tucked between thick forest and rocky hills. No neighbors, no Wi-Fi, no phone signal. Exactly what I was looking for. The place was in upstate Maine, a few hours from the closest town, which was already barely a dot on the map. I booked it for 7 nights, a full week to clear my head. I packed light, just some clothes, canned food, a camping stove, water jugs, flashlight, a pocket knife, a sleeping bag, and a book I never got around to finishing. The owner had left detailed directions in a follow-up email. It started paved, then turned into gravel, then finally a narrow dirt path that looked more like an animal trail than a road. I had to park the car a half-mile away and hike the rest. No big deal. I liked that it was hidden. When I reached the cabin that first afternoon, I felt proud. It was even better in person. Quiet, still. The lake was wide and flat like glass. The trees around it stood tall and heavy with early autumn leaves. The air was cooler up there, fresh and slightly damp like it had just rained, though it hadn't. The cabin itself was basic but solid. One room, a cot, a small table, a wood-burning stove. No power, no plumbing, just an outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin. There was a shed next to the cabin too, locked with a rusty padlock. I unlocked the front door with the key the owner had mailed me and stepped inside. It smelled like dry wood and something older, maybe mildew or dust, but it felt fine. Lived in, but not messy. I opened the small windows for some air and looked around. The walls were covered in scratches and old nails, maybe from stuff people used to hang. The floor creaked when I walked, but it held firm. I dropped my bag and sat on the cot, breathing in that silence that city people never really get. That first night, I cooked some beans over the camping stove on the porch and watched the sun drop behind the trees. The water went pink, then dark. I used a lantern to read for a bit, then climbed into the cot. The sounds outside were louder than I expected. Not traffic or people, nature sounds. Crickets, branches creaking, something moving in the woods. I told myself it was deer, maybe a raccoon. But every time something cracked or shifted outside, I felt my body tighten a little. I had never been this far from people. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a thud. It was dull, like something heavy dropping onto dirt. I sat up, heart pounding, and held my breath. I listened hard. It was silent again. No crickets, no wind, just dead still. I lay back down and stared at the wooden ceiling for a long time, waiting for another sound. It never came. I must have drifted off eventually, but my sleep was light and restless after that. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I hiked around the lake, took pictures, ate jerky and trail mix, and tried to read. But I kept catching myself glancing toward the woods. At one point, I found a footprint in the mud near the waterline. It was a boot print larger than mine. Maybe the owner's, I thought, or another renter before me. It didn't look fresh. I decided not to dwell on it. By the third day, things started to feel off. I was boiling water by the stove when I noticed something moved through the trees across the lake. Just a flicker like someone walking. I squinted and stood still, but I didn't see anything else. Could have been wind, I told myself. Shadows, but there was no wind. That night, I double-checked the lock on the cabin door. It was a sliding bolt from the inside. Not heavy-duty, but enough to keep out animals. I set the lantern near the bed and lay down with my pocket knife under my pillow, just in case. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 a.m., I heard rustling near the side of the cabin. Slow steps on dry leaves. I sat up, heart racing, and held the knife tight. The steps circled the cabin once. I heard them stop near the shed. Then nothing. I waited like that for over an hour. The next morning, I walked over to the shed. The padlock was still there, but the dirt near the door was disturbed, like someone had been standing there. I saw no tracks, just loose soil and flattened grass. I didn't know what to think. I had no way to call for help. My phone had been dead since day one. I had left the charger in the car, which was too far to be helpful. I told myself I was imagining things, that my brain was making drama out of nothing. Still, I felt watched. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with the knife in my lap, just staring at the woods. I didn't eat much. I barely drank water. I felt on edge, like something was waiting, like I'd stepped into some situation I didn't understand. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but that would mean hiking back in the dark to the car. I didn't like that idea either. I told myself one more night. If anything weird happened again, I'd leave at first light. That night was the worst. I woke up to the sound of the doorknob jiggling. Not forceful, just gentle testing. I shot upright in the cot and held my breath. The bolt on the door rattled faintly. Then I heard footsteps, slow and careful, moving to the window on the left side. I reached over and shut off the lantern. Total darkness. My heart was slamming in my chest. The footsteps moved again, back to the door. Then silence. I didn't sleep after that. When morning finally came, I opened the door and stepped out slowly. The front steps had fresh dirt on them, like someone had been standing there. I walked a few feet out and turned back toward the woods. There was something on the ground at the tree line. A piece of paper weighed down by a rock. I didn't want to approach it, but I had to know. I walked over and lifted the rock. The paper was torn from a notebook. On it, written in blocky, messy letters, was a single word. Leave. That was it. No signature. No explanation. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just grabbed my bag, the knife, the lantern, and bolted down the trail toward my car. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I pushed through branches and stumbled over roots. When I reached the car, I got inside and locked the doors, gasping for air. I drove until I hit pavement. Then I drove for another hour past that, until I reached the small town near the highway. I went straight to a diner, sat in the corner, and just breathed. I hadn't eaten properly in 2 days. I didn't feel hungry now either, just hollow, empty, exhausted. I called the cabin owner later that day using a phone at the gas station. I didn't go into detail, just said I left early. He didn't ask questions, said he understood. That made it worse somehow. I didn't sleep well for weeks after that. I kept thinking about that night, the way the doorknob turned slowly, the note at the tree line. I kept wondering what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. Who had left the note? Why? Months later, I came across that listing again on the same website. The cabin was gone, removed completely. No photos, no description, nothing, like it had never been there. I tried to search the name of the owner. Nothing came up, not even an old listing or cached page. I don't talk about it much, not because I'm afraid no one will believe me, but because it changed how I see things, how I trust people, how I trust myself when I'm alone. I never went on a solo trip again. I never will, not because I'm scared of the woods or the silence or the dark, but because I learned something important out there. Some places don't want you there. Some places want you gone. And if you're smart, you'll listen before it's too late. It started when I booked a last-minute trip to a remote cabin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I had been dealing with a lot of stress from work, and I just needed to get away from everything. I didn't want to be around people. I didn't want to be near traffic or noise or emails. I wanted silence, nature, and distance. A friend of mine had once mentioned a small off-grid cabin they had rented years ago, and after some digging, I found the listing online. It wasn't on any big rental site. It was posted on a tiny, outdated forum. I messaged the owner, wired them money through an old PayPal link, and they sent me GPS coordinates, instructions on how to get there, and a few rules. The drive took longer than I expected. It was early October, and the trees were a mix of gold, orange, and red. But the beauty of the fall colors was muted by the fact that I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. Once I turned off the highway, it was 30 miles of dirt roads and forest. The last 3 miles were barely more than a trail, with deep ruts and overhanging branches scraping the top of my car. The signal was completely gone. No bars, no service, nothing. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon. It looked like something from a postcard. A single-story log structure with a metal roof, tucked deep into the woods. There was a small clearing around it, and a fire pit with a few chopped logs nearby. No electricity, no running water. There was a hand pump for water out back, a composting toilet in a small outhouse, and a wood stove inside. It was basic, but it felt like exactly what I needed. I unpacked my gear, mostly canned food, water jugs, a camping stove, and some books, and settled in. That first night, it was quiet in a way that I hadn't experienced in years. Not the fake quiet of suburbs or late nights in the city. Real, complete quiet. No hum of electronics. No distant cars. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. I fell asleep easily. The second day, I spent hiking around the area. I marked trees with orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. The trails weren't marked, but the forest was manageable if you paid attention. I walked for hours, saw a few deer, heard the distinct yips of coyotes far off. Around midday, I stopped and had a snack on a rock outcropping. I checked my phone out of habit, no service of course, then tucked it away again. I made it back to the cabin well before sunset, started a fire outside, and cooked a simple meal. That night, I noticed the sounds of the forest were a little different. It was subtle, fewer bird calls as the sun went down, fewer rustlings in the underbrush. I chalked it up to the weather cooling down and the shift toward late autumn. Still, something about it felt off. I pushed the thought away, read for a while by lantern light, and went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside. Took me a few seconds to register what I was hearing. Leaves crunching, slow, steady steps. Not an animal. Not the quick scamper of a raccoon or the shuffle of a deer. Human steps. I sat up, my heart pounding. There was no lock on the cabin door, just a latch from the inside. I reached for the flashlight I kept beside the bed and turned it on. The beam was weak. Batteries were already dying. I didn't want to make noise, so I didn't call out. I just sat there, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once. Then they stopped. I held my breath. Minutes passed. I heard nothing else. Eventually, I got up, crept to the door, and pressed my ear against it. Nothing. I opened the door slowly and shone the flashlight around. Nothing. Just trees and moonlight and the faint glow of the dying fire in the pit. I went back inside and didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I walked around the clearing, looking for footprints. I I found them, not animal tracks, boots, a man's boots by the size of them. They came from the woods on the east side, circled the cabin, and disappeared back the same way. I felt a deep chill in my chest. I had no weapons with me, just a hatchet, a pocket knife, and some bear spray. I kept the hatchet on my belt that day and stayed close to the cabin. That night, I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold food from a can and stayed inside. I listened carefully. No footsteps, but I didn't feel alone. The fourth day, I decided to leave. I packed my things, loaded the car, and started driving. I made it about 10 miles down the dirt road before I saw the tree. It had been pushed across the path. A fresh tree, green leaves still attached. Not fallen naturally. The base was cut clean. Someone had chopped it down and dragged it across the road. My stomach dropped. I got out and tried to move it, but it was too big. I had a small saw in my trunk, and I spent nearly 2 hours cutting it into sections small enough to drag aside. All the while, I felt like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder. No one, but I couldn't shake the feeling. When I finally got back in the car and kept driving, I didn't relax until I hit pavement. I drove to the nearest town, found a small motel, and stayed the night. I turned on the TV for noise. I checked my phone obsessively. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Felt too strange, too unbelievable. A week later, back home, I decided to email the person who had rented me the cabin. I asked if anyone else lived in that area, if there were any other cabins or hunting camps nearby. I never got a reply. A few days after that, I went back to the listing. It was gone. The forum it had been posted on was still up, but the post was gone. I checked the user's profile. Deleted. I did some reverse image searching on the photos from the listing. I had saved them on my phone. They had been pulled from an old real estate listing from 6 years earlier. A completely different name was listed on the property records. I called the county clerk's office in that area and asked if the cabin was owned or rented. The woman I spoke to told me it had been abandoned after the previous owner passed away 5 years earlier. It was never listed as a rental. I never figured out who I sent my money to. I still think about it sometimes. What would have happened if I stayed another night? If I hadn't left that day? If I hadn't brought the saw? I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but they knew I was alone. They knew I had no signal. They knew the roads. They had been watching. Now, I don't go on trips alone anymore. I don't rent cabins unless they're part of a well-known chain or platform. And I always tell someone where I'm going. I think about the boots, the clean cut at the base of that tree, the footsteps in the middle of the night, the fact that the cabin was never really for rent. Someone wanted me out there, alone, and someone came for me in the dark. It started when I decided I needed to get away from everything for a while. I work a desk job in the city, 10-hour days in a cubicle, surrounded by fluorescent lights and ringing phones. After the third time, I found myself sitting in my car for an hour after work, unable to drive because I felt so empty. I knew I needed a break. I looked online for a cabin to rent, somewhere quiet and far from the city. I didn't care about luxury or even cell service. I just wanted peace and silence. I found this listing on a lesser-known site. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. No neighbors in sight, just a gravel road leading to it and trees all around. It wasn't pretty, but it was exactly what I wanted: basic, remote, and cheap. The owner, a guy named Carl, emailed me the key code and said I could go up anytime. He didn't ask many questions. I took a week off work, packed up my car with enough food, water, and supplies for 10 days, just in case, and left the city early one Saturday morning. It was a 6-hour drive, most of it on highway, then back roads, then finally a single-lane gravel path that rattled my little sedan until I had to slow to a crawl. The cabin didn't have a number. I just followed the mile markers Carl had sent me. When I finally pulled up, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The cabin was even more basic than I expected. Just one room, a kitchenette, a wood stove, a twin bed, and a tiny bathroom with a composting toilet and no running water. I didn't mind. I brought a water tank and a camping shower. I wasn't here for comfort. I just needed to stop hearing traffic. Stop reading emails. Stop seeing other people. The first day was good. I unpacked my supplies, made some instant noodles, and sat on the front porch watching the sun go down. It was completely silent except for the wind in the trees and the occasional creak from the wooden deck. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in months. The second day, I started exploring. There was a trail behind the cabin that led into the woods. It wasn't marked, but it was well worn enough that I figured it had been used before. I walked for maybe an hour before turning back, not wanting to get lost. I made note of a few downed trees and a fork in the path so I wouldn't miss it coming back. When I returned, I made some coffee and sat out on the porch again. But that night, something felt off. It started with a sound. Around 2 in the morning, I was still awake. I'd had trouble sleeping lately, even here. I kept hearing little noises, branches snapping, rustling leaves. I told myself it was animals, probably deer or raccoons. But then I heard what sounded like footsteps. Not the fast scurry of animals, but slow, heavy crunching on the gravel outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, listening. It was pitch black inside. I hadn't brought a lamp, just a flashlight and my phone, which I was trying not to use. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it through the window. I couldn't see anything, but the sound stopped as soon as I did that. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I laid there listening for more sounds, but everything stayed quiet. The next morning, I checked outside. There weren't any tracks in the gravel that I could see. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the woods just play tricks on your ears when you're not used to them. I went on another hike that day, farther this time, trying to distract myself. It worked for a while. That night, it happened again. Footsteps, slow, steady, coming around the side of the cabin. I froze. This time, I didn't go to the window. I just stayed still, holding my breath. The steps stopped, then started again. I couldn't tell if they were moving away or just shifting around the porch. Eventually, they faded. I waited until daylight, then checked again. Still no tracks, no sign of anything. I started to feel paranoid, like I was being watched. I kept telling myself I was just on edge from work, that I was used to noise and people and constant distractions. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried to make it through the third night. I locked the door and pushed a chair in front of it. I didn't have a gun, just a pocket knife. I kept it on me even while I slept. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time, I could swear they came right up to the door. I thought I heard the doorknob jiggle. I sat up, heart pounding, and just waited. Nothing else happened. In the morning, I'd had enough. I told myself I was going to cut the trip short and head back. But when I opened the door, I found something sitting on the porch. It was a small pile of rocks, neatly stacked, like a little cairn. I hadn't put it there. I didn't know what to make of it. I packed my bag and went to start the car. It wouldn't start. Battery was dead. I checked my phone, no signal. I hadn't brought a power bank. I turned it off at night to save battery, and now it was nearly dead too. I was stuck. I had food and water, but not enough for much longer. I decided I'd have to hike out to the nearest town. According to Carl's email, the closest gas station was about 9 miles down the gravel road. I didn't know how far the next house was, but I figured I'd try the road first. I spent that day trying to stay calm. I rationed some food, boiled water, tried the car again just in case. Nothing. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the chair by the door with my flashlight and knife. The footsteps came again. This time, they circled the cabin. I heard them crunch on the gravel, then leaves, then gravel again. I felt like something was waiting, just outside the reach of my flashlight. At one point, I thought I heard breathing. I didn't open the door. By morning, I was done. I filled my backpack with supplies, left a note in the cabin just in case, and started walking. It was harder than I expected. The gravel road twisted and turned, and the trees were thick on both sides. I didn't see any cars, didn't see any people. I walked for hours. My feet were blistered, my back ached. I kept turning around, thinking I heard someone behind me, but no one was there. Eventually, I came to a split in the road. I didn't remember Carl saying anything about a fork, I chose the left path, figuring it headed downhill and might lead to town. But after another hour, I realized I was going in circles. I passed a rusted mailbox I'd seen before. I was lost. The sun started to dip again. I had no tent, no sleeping bag, just a flashlight and my knife. I found a patch of ground under a tree and sat down, too tired to walk anymore. I tried not to think about the footsteps. That night was the worst. I heard them again, but not just one set, two, maybe three. They were all around me. I shined my flashlight but saw nothing. I didn't sleep at all. I just sat with my knife, heart racing, sweating even though the air was cold. By morning, I was half crazy. I picked a direction and started walking. I followed the sun, figuring east had to lead somewhere. I didn't even care about the road anymore. I just needed out. Sometime that afternoon, I stumbled onto a hunter's shack. It looked abandoned, but it had a radio inside. It didn't work, but there was a flare gun. I took it. I climbed onto the roof and fired the flare. I didn't know if anyone would see it. I waited. Hours passed. Just before sunset, I heard an engine. A game warden found me. He said they saw the flare from a lookout tower. I didn't even know those existed anymore. I told him everything about the footsteps, the stacked rocks, the car. He looked at me like I'd been out there too long. He said people sometimes get turned around and panic. He gave me a ride to town. I called a tow service for my car. They said the battery was completely drained, like something had been running for hours, but I hadn't left anything on. I never found out who was outside my cabin. The local sheriff said they'd check it out, but didn't find anyone. Just some boot prints in the dirt. Could have been mine, they said, but I know they weren't. I sold my car a month later. I moved into a small apartment in the city and haven't left town since. I don't hike anymore. I don't camp. Sometimes I still hear footsteps in my dreams. But now I always sleep with the light on. And I never, ever book anything that doesn't show up on Google Maps. I rented a remote cabin deep in the Colorado woods last October. I had a long stretch of unused vacation days and just wanted a quiet place to disconnect. I was tired, the kind of tired that didn't go away with sleep. I didn't want to be around people. I didn't want to hear traffic. I didn't want to be near cell service. I just wanted to sit in silence and let the cold air burn out whatever was sitting heavy inside me. I found the cabin on a website that listed off-grid rentals. It was about 4 miles off a narrow service road with no real signage. You had to hike the last mile to get there. The listing emphasized solitude and self-sufficiency. That's what I wanted. I booked it for 2 weeks and packed like I was disappearing. The hike in was rough. The air was thin and crisp, and the sky was darkening fast. I had a 50-pound pack with food, a water filter, firewood starter, sleeping bag, some winter gear, and a few tools. I followed a crude path through thick trees and eventually came up to the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was old but solid, one story, weathered pine siding, a metal roof, one front window, and a heavy wooden door. No electricity, no plumbing. There was a dry outhouse about 50 feet behind it. A wood-burning stove sat inside the corner. A few cabinets with some canned goods, a cast iron pan, and a cot with thin bedding. That was it. It was perfect. The first 3 days were peaceful. I spent time reading, hiking around the woods, gathering firewood, and sitting on the small porch watching the wind stir through the treetops. I ate simple meals and slept early. The silence was thick, and I could hear every gust of wind, every snap of a twig, every small rustle in the leaves. I got used to it quickly. The cold would creep in at night, and I'd stay tucked into my sleeping bag by the fire until morning light trickled in through the small window. On the 4th day, I went on a longer hike. I wanted to follow the slope west of the cabin, deeper into the forest. There was no trail. I used a compass and tried to keep track of major landmarks, large rock formations, broken tree stumps, anything to help me find my way back. I walked for hours, exploring a gully and then a higher ridge where I saw old animal bones picked clean. Probably deer, maybe elk, coyotes or mountain lions maybe. I saw no signs of humans. No wrappers, no carvings on trees, no campsites. It was wild and untouched. I liked it that way. Around late afternoon, clouds started to move in fast. I turned around and made my way back, but I misjudged the path. I must have veered east without realizing it. The sun was dropping, and everything started to look the same. Trees, moss, fallen logs. I got nervous. I stopped walking to listen, to think. I pulled out the compass and tried to backtrack. I moved faster, heart pounding, realizing how easy it was to get turned around out there. Eventually, I saw a familiar boulder and knew I was on the right track. I made it back to the cabin just as twilight slipped into full darkness. I was sweating through my layers and my legs were sore. I made a fire and heated up a can of stew. I sat in front of the fire for hours that night, shaken by how easy it would have been to vanish out there. The next day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped more wood, reorganized supplies, and rested. That evening, as I was getting ready to sleep, I noticed something strange. The latch on the cabin door, it looked like it had been scratched. Not deep gouges, but enough that I could see the fresh marks in the wood. I had been locking the door from the inside every night. Maybe it was an animal, but the scratches didn't look like claws. They were straight, more like someone had used a key or a knife tip. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the fire going and stayed alert, listening. Nothing happened, just the wind and the occasional creak of the roof as the temperature dropped. In the morning, I checked the area around the cabin. No tracks, just frozen ground and leaves. Still, it unsettled me. I reminded myself there were no roads nearby, no other cabins. No reason anyone would be out here unless they were seriously lost or hiding. On the 7th night, I heard a noise just after midnight. It wasn't the usual animal sounds. It was sharper, repetitive, like small rocks hitting the side of the cabin. I sat up in my sleeping bag and waited. It stopped. Then it happened again. 3 sharp taps. I stood up and moved to the window. It was pitch black outside. I couldn't see anything. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and pointed it out the window. Nothing, just trees. Then I heard crunching in the leaves. Slow steps. 1, 2, 3. Then it stopped. I turned off the flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard I felt sick. I waited in silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I opened the door and looked around. There were boot prints in the dirt just outside. They weren't mine. Too big, wider tread. They circled the cabin once and disappeared back into the woods. I stood there for a long time staring at them. Someone had been out there, watching, maybe trying to get inside. I spent that day preparing to leave. I packed my gear and tightened everything down. I wasn't supposed to hike out until day 14, but I wasn't staying. That night, I built a fire inside the stove, shut the door, and kept my boots on. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the corner, knife in hand, backpack ready. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps again. This time they came from the back, near the outhouse. Then they moved along the side of the cabin. Crunch, crunch, crunch. They stopped right outside the door. I held my breath. I could hear breathing. Slow, steady. I didn't move. I didn't blink. Then silence. No retreating steps. No sound at all. Just cold, awful silence. At first light, I opened the door fast and stepped out, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The prints were there again, deep this time, like someone had been standing there a while. Same boots, same direction. I followed them a few yards into the trees and then they vanished. No drag marks, no trail, just gone. I didn't waste more time. I strapped on my pack and hiked out fast. I didn't stop once. I kept checking behind me. I kept hearing things. Maybe animals, maybe not. It took me less than 2 hours to reach the service road. I walked another 4 miles until I found my car parked at the lot near the highway. I didn't look back. I drove straight through the day and into the night, not stopping until I was back in Denver. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What would I even say? Weeks later, I looked up that listing again out of curiosity. The cabin had been removed. No contact info, no rental page, like it was never there. I know what I saw. I know someone was out there, And I know if I hadn't left when I did, I might not be here to write this. Sometimes I think about how deep those woods go, how easy it is for someone to disappear, how many people never make it back out. I don't go camping anymore. I don't go hiking either. When I need to clear my head now, I take a drive through town, windows up, doors locked, surrounded by people. It's not the peace I used to crave, but it's the kind that keeps me alive. That's enough for me. I was 37 when I decided to take a break from everything and rent a cabin in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had gone through a rough stretch at work and just wanted silence and space to think. I found an old cabin online that was far from any main roads, tucked away deep in the woods, miles off the nearest dirt road. It was basic, no Wi-Fi, no TV, and the power came from a small solar panel setup. That was exactly what I wanted. The owner left the key under a rock near the door. I arrived just before sunset. The road to the cabin was mostly just gravel, and eventually, it turned into a narrow trail where I had to park my truck and hike in about half a mile. I had a big hiking backpack loaded with supplies, canned food, a sleeping bag, a few changes of clothes, and a large flashlight. I also brought a hunting knife and an old pistol just in case I ran into a bear or something. I wasn't planning on using it, but I felt better having it. The cabin looked old but solid. The logs were thick and darkened from age. It had a small porch with a creaky rocking chair and one dusty window in the front. Inside, there was a single bed, a table, 2 chairs, a tiny kitchen area, and a wood-burning stove. It was musty and cold, but peaceful. No cell signal, no sounds of cars, just wind and trees. That first night, I unpacked, lit a few candles, and made some instant noodles on the small propane burner. I sat on the porch as it got dark, drinking cheap whiskey from a metal flask and listening to the wind rustling the trees. I remember thinking how good it felt to be disconnected from everything. No emails, no calls, no expectations, just me, the woods, and time. Around midnight, I heard something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just wind, but then I heard it again. A clear crunch of leaves, then another. It was slow, steady. I turned off the lantern inside and stood by the window, watching. I didn't see anything, but I felt something. It was that instinct you get when you're not alone, like someone's behind you even when you don't hear them. I stood there for 10 minutes, maybe more. Finally, it stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer and forced myself to go to bed. The next morning, I went for a long walk through the woods, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I followed a narrow animal trail that wound through tall pine trees and over rocky ground. After about 2 miles, I came across what looked like an old hunting blind, half collapsed. It had a few rusty cans scattered around it, and the wooden structure was rotting. I took a few pictures on my phone even though I had no signal. I figured I could look it up when I got home. I stayed out there for a few hours just walking. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something odd. One of the windows, the one in the back near the bed, looked different. I stepped closer. There were small smudges on the glass, like fingerprints but not quite right. They were longer, almost like someone had pressed wet sticks against the glass. I told myself it could have been from my breath last night or condensation, but it felt off. That night, it was harder to sleep. I kept hearing noises, scratching, light thuds on the porch. Once, the rocking chair creaked like something had sat in it. I gripped the knife under my pillow and stayed awake until morning. By the 3rd day, I was starting to feel paranoid. I hadn't seen anyone since I got there, and the noises at night were getting worse. Around sunset, I checked around the cabin, circling the whole structure. On the far side, behind the kitchen wall, I found tracks. Not animal tracks, footprints, barefoot, human, but the toes looked too long, like they stretched out further than normal. The prints went toward the tree line, then vanished. I stood there for a long time, staring into the woods. I didn't see anyone. The woods were dead quiet. I went back inside, locked the door, and pushed the table in front of it. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I hiked out to my truck. The trail was exactly as I remembered, but when I got to my truck, something had messed with it. The driver's side mirror was broken off and lying on the ground. There were long scratches down the side, like claws or branches had raked it, but they were too clean, too evenly spaced. I checked under the truck and inside. Nothing. Everything else was untouched. I thought about driving out right then, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I didn't want to admit I was scared. So I went back. That night it rained. I sat by the stove, reading an old book I found on the shelf, some wilderness survival manual from the 1970s. The rain was steady, hitting the metal roof like a soft drum. It was almost comforting. Then I heard it again. Tap on the window. I froze. The cabin only had one window in front and one in the back. The front one was covered by a curtain I had hung with some fishing line. I walked to the back, quietly. Another tap, then another. I held the flashlight tight and moved the curtain aside just enough to peek out. Nothing. Then something moved at the edge of the trees. It was fast, just a flash of a figure. I dropped the curtain and backed away. My heart was pounding. I grabbed the pistol and sat with my back against the wall, watching both windows. The taps didn't come again, but I didn't sleep. In the morning, the ground was soaked and muddy. I found more prints around the cabin, circling it. Same bare feet, same long toes. I decided I was leaving. I packed everything as fast as I could and started hiking to the truck. When I got there, the passenger door was wide open. I never left it like that. I approached slowly, pistol raised. The inside was dry, nothing stolen. But on the seat was something that didn't belong. A small, perfectly smooth rock. Polished, round, sitting in the center of the seat. I didn't touch it. I closed the door, locked everything, and got in. I drove out fast, not caring if I scraped the truck on the trees. It took me 2 hours to get to the nearest gas station. I didn't talk to anyone. I filled up and drove straight home. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Felt too strange, too hard to explain without sounding crazy. A few weeks later, I finally looked at the pictures I took on my phone. Most were just woods and trees, but the one of the old hunting blind had something in the background. In the trees behind the blind was a figure. It was dark, almost blending in, but it was there, tall, thin, barefoot, watching. I deleted the photo. I never went back to Idaho. I never stayed in another cabin. I don't even like camping anymore. People ask me why I changed so much, and I just tell them I got tired of the outdoors. But the truth is, I saw something out there, and it saw me, and that was enough. The cabin was later taken off the listing site. When I looked it up months later, the owner had stopped renting it out. The last review was from someone who mentioned hearing things at night and feeling watched. It was the only review. I don't know if they saw what I did. I hope they didn't. I still think about it sometimes. The sound of tapping on the window, the figure in the woods, the rock left in my truck. I never found out what it was or why it was there, but I got out. I made it home, and that's all that matters. I stayed alive. I needed a break from everything. Work had been chewing me up for the past few months, and I hadn't had a real day off in over a year. I wasn't sleeping well, wasn't eating right, and all the days were starting to blur together. So I decided to rent a remote cabin in the northern part of Minnesota, somewhere near the edge of the Chippewa National Forest. It was just me going, no friends, no family, no internet, no phone reception. I wanted quiet, real, pure quiet. The cabin was a small one-bedroom place about 2 miles off a narrow dirt road. It was surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The owner had left a note with simple instructions about using the propane heater and where to find extra firewood. There was a small creek about 50 yards behind the cabin and a rusty old hand pump for water near the front. No electricity, no cell service, and no neighbors in sight. Just me and nature. That first day, it felt perfect. I got there just before sunset. The air smelled clean and cold. I unpacked quickly, lit a fire in the stove, and boiled some water for instant noodles. After dinner, I sat outside in an old wooden chair, listening to the wind in the trees and watching the stars appear. It was the most peace I'd felt in a long time. The first night was uneventful. I slept well, probably better than I had in months. In the morning, I made coffee over the fire, ate a granola bar, and went for a short hike through the trees. I marked my path carefully, using red tape on branches so I wouldn't get turned around. The forest was dense and silent except for the occasional bird or rustle of a squirrel. After a couple of hours, I made my way back, cooked some rice and beans on the fire, and read a paperback novel until sunset. On the third day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I packed a small bag with water, snacks, a map, and a compass. I still marked my path but went farther than before. The trees grew thicker the deeper I went, and the terrain got rougher. Around midday, I came across an old hunting blind. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The wood was gray and splintered, and some of the boards were falling off. There were empty shell casings scattered nearby and a rusted tin can hanging from a nail. I sat for a while, drank some water, and kept going. About an hour later, I stumbled onto something I didn't expect to see out there. A small, moss-covered shack. It wasn't on the map. The roof sagged, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. There were no windows, just two wooden slits on the front. Something about it made me uneasy. I didn't go inside. I walked around it once, kept my distance, and then turned back. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept thinking about that shack. It felt out of place, and something about it bothered me. Maybe it was the way the forest around it seemed unnaturally quiet. I tried to shake the feeling, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, heart pounding, sure that I'd heard something outside. Once I even got up and looked out the window with a flashlight, but I didn't see anything. On the fourth day, I tried to brush it off. I stayed near the cabin, chopped some wood, did some sketching, and made a stew over the fire. But as the sun started to go down, I got the feeling again, like something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder and checking the tree line. Nothing was there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, I heard something. Just after midnight, I was lying in bed. The fire in the stove had died down, and the only sound was the creaking of the old wood and the wind. Then I heard a crunch outside, like someone stepping on frozen leaves. Came from the side of the cabin, near the hand pump. My body froze. I held my breath and waited. There was another crunch, then nothing. I got up slowly, grabbed my flashlight, and pointed it through the window. Couldn't see much, just the edge of the clearing and the blackness beyond. I didn't hear anything else, so I went back to bed, but I barely slept. The next morning, I checked the area near the pump. I found a mark in the dirt. It wasn't a boot print, but something had definitely disturbed the ground. It looked fresh. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. I didn't want to think about other possibilities. That afternoon, I hiked back toward the shack. I don't know why. Curiosity, I guess. Or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself it was nothing. When I got close, I noticed something different. The door was closed. I was sure it had been half open the last time. Now it was shut tight. I approached slowly, heart thumping. I called out just in case someone was living there, but there was no answer. I knocked on the door. Still nothing. I didn't go in. I just stood there listening. I didn't hear anything inside, but I could feel something, like I was being watched. I backed away and returned to the cabin quickly, looking over my shoulder the whole time. That night, it got worse. I heard more sounds, scraping near the walls like something dragging across the wood. Then a thud, like a fist hitting the outside. I stayed in bed, holding the hatchet I kept near the door. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I went outside. I found fresh scrapes on the side of the cabin, near the window. Deep ones, like something sharp had been dragged across the wood. That was it. I decided I was leaving. I packed quickly and started hiking out toward the dirt road. But when I got there, I found something that made my stomach drop. My car had been messed with. The tires were slashed, all four of them. I stood there for a long time just staring. There was no way to call for help. No signal, no people. The nearest ranger station was probably over 10 miles away. I could walk, but I had to go back to the cabin first to rest and plan it out. Back at the cabin, I double-checked all the windows and doors. I brought everything inside: food, tools, water, even firewood. I blocked the door with a table and kept the hatchet close. I boiled water, made some food, and waited. That night was the worst. Started around midnight. I heard footsteps, not animal ones, human ones. They crunched slowly around the cabin. Then silence. Then tapping on the window, light like fingernails. Then the doorknob jiggled. Softly, then harder. I didn't move. I sat in the corner with the hatchet, heart racing. Hours passed like that. Creaking, tapping, silence. Then just before dawn, it stopped. When the sun came up, I opened the door and looked around. No footprints. Nothing. But the feeling didn't leave me. I knew I had to leave. I packed again and started walking the road, even though I knew it would take all day. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. The forest felt different now. Less peaceful. More watchful. I walked for hours. Around noon, I heard something behind me. Not footsteps, but a distant sound, like something heavy moving through the trees. I didn't stop. I just walked faster. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing with an old wooden sign that pointed toward a ranger station 3 miles ahead. I kept going even though my legs were aching and I was nearly out of water. When I finally reached the station, I nearly collapsed. The ranger on duty gave me water, listened to my story, and called for a tow. I didn't mention the shack. I didn't mention the sounds. I just said I got spooked and my car had been vandalized. They towed my car the next day. I stayed in a nearby town overnight, in a motel with thick curtains and locks on every door. I never went back to that cabin, never asked for a refund. I didn't even leave a review. I still don't know who or what was out there, but it wasn't a ghost. It was real. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, and I got out just in time. I rented the cabin to get away from everything. I was tired of people, traffic, work, my phone. I needed something quiet and far away. I found the place online. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal. Just a small wooden cabin in the northern part of the state near a lake. The photos showed tall trees, a narrow dirt road, and a plain wooden dock leading out onto the water. It looked exactly like what I needed. I drove up on a Monday morning in late October. The leaves had already turned. The colors were beautiful. Red, yellow, orange, and every gust of wind scattered them across the road. The drive was peaceful once I got off the highway. The smaller roads twisted and curved through forests and hills. The last 10 miles were all dirt road. My tires kicked up dust, and the trees seemed to close in on me the farther I went. There were no other cars, no other houses, just trees and silence. When I pulled up to the cabin, I was surprised how small it was. The porch sagged a little and the wood was dark with age. The windows were dusty, and a pile of chopped firewood was stacked under the overhang. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a moment. It was colder than I expected. The sun was still out, but the wind had a bite to it. Inside the cabin, everything was basic. One bedroom, a kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a tiny living room with a beat-up couch and a coffee table, and a small bathroom with a composting toilet. No electricity except for a small solar setup to charge a lantern. There was no refrigerator, just a cooler outside with a latch to keep animals out. I brought dry food, canned goods, and a few packs of bottled water. The first day was easy. I unpacked, chopped a little more firewood, and walked down to the lake. It was still and clear like glass. The dock creaked under my feet, and when I sat at the end, I could see fish moving slowly in the shallows. That night, I built a fire in the stove and read by lantern light until I got tired. The silence was perfect. No traffic, no hum of electronics, just the wind and the creaking of the cabin. By the second day, I noticed how quiet the woods were. I didn't hear many birds. I didn't see any squirrels. I thought maybe the cold had driven most animals to shelter. Still, it felt off. Too still. I tried not to think about it. I cooked, wrote in my notebook, took long walks, and even started drawing again. The quiet was starting to get to me, though. I caught myself listening too hard. Every creak in the cabin, every snap of a twig outside made me stop and hold my breath. On the third day, I found something strange in the woods. I was walking a narrow trail that wound away from the lake, deeper into the forest. I didn't plan to go far, just stretch my legs. About 20 minutes in, I noticed a smell, something faint but sharp, like rust and dirt and old meat. I thought maybe an animal had died nearby. Then I saw it. It was a pile of bones. At first, I thought it was from a deer or something, but the way the bones were arranged looked deliberate. Cleaned, bleached by the sun. The ribs had been stacked in a row, and the skull, probably from a raccoon or something small, was placed neatly on top. It looked like some kind of ritual, but not anything I recognized. I backed away slowly. The forest felt heavier, like something was watching. I turned and walked back to the cabin, faster than before. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every noise outside felt amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. I locked the door, shut all the windows, and kept the fire going. I slept in short bursts, always waking up to silence and the sense that something was moving outside. I told myself it was just my imagination. Isolation plays tricks on people. The next morning, I found footprints. They were in the dirt near the side of the cabin, near the pile of firewood. They were fresh, not from boots, not shoes either, bare feet, adult-sized. The toes were wide apart, and the arch was deep, like someone had walked around the cabin barefoot during the night. My stomach turned. I looked around but saw no one. The prints led into the woods but disappeared after a few feet. The dirt was too hard-packed beyond that. I considered leaving, packing up and driving out. But I told myself it was probably a hiker, maybe someone camping nearby. I tried to brush it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. Who walks barefoot through the woods at night in late October? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I kept the axe nearby. I watched the woods. Nothing moved. No sounds. Just wind and leaves. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but my body stayed tense, like it was expecting something to happen. That night, I heard it. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. Something tapping against the front wall. Not fast, just a slow, soft tapping. Then it stopped. I sat in bed, holding my breath. Then the tapping started again, closer to the window this time. I grabbed the lantern and turned it on, heart pounding. I didn't see anything out the window, just trees and darkness. The sound stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found a small bundle on the porch. It was wrapped in old cloth, tied with twine. I didn't want to open it, but I did. Inside were feathers, small bones, and something that looked like dried skin or hide. I nearly gagged. I threw it into the woods and stayed inside the cabin for the rest of the day. I decided to leave the next morning. I packed everything, loaded the car, and checked the cabin 3 times. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and sat with the axe in my lap, listening. First light, I left, but the road was blocked. A tree had fallen across the dirt road. Not just any tree, a huge one, thick and old. Its roots were torn up, but the trunk had landed clean across the path like it had been placed there. Couldn't move it, not alone. I tried driving around, but the underbrush was too thick. Couldn't get through. I was stuck. I went back to the cabin. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what else to do. I kept the axe with me and stayed close to the fire. My food was running low, but I could make it a few more days if I rationed. That night, I heard footsteps, clear, slow, circling the cabin. Then I heard breathing, close to the window. I didn't move. I didn't turn on the lantern. I just sat in the dark, listening, holding the axe. Then, nothing. Silence again. In the morning, I checked outside. More footprints, bare feet, closer this time. I looked into the woods but saw nothing. I knew I had to get out. I grabbed my pack, my axe, and a bottle of water, and I started walking down the road. I had no choice. I needed to find help. I walked for hours. My legs hurt. My shoulders ached. I didn't see any other people, no cars. I tried not to look behind me, but every so often, I swore I heard something. A twig snapping, leaves crunching. I didn't stop. Late in the day, I saw a sign. Painted wood, old and cracked. It pointed toward a ranger station 3 miles away. I kept going. I made it just before dark. The building was locked, but there was a radio box out front. I hit the emergency call button. A voice came back. I almost cried. I explained what happened briefly, and they told me to sit tight. An hour later, a truck pulled up. 2 rangers. They looked concerned. They drove me back to town. I didn't talk much. I just wanted to get away. The rangers went back the next day. They checked the cabin, the road, the woods. They didn't find anything. No footprints. No bundle. The tree was gone, too. I don't know what was out there. I don't know who left those prints or the bundle. I don't know why they didn't come into the cabin. Maybe the fire. Maybe they just wanted to scare me. Or maybe they were waiting for something. I sold everything after that. My gear. My car. I moved back to the city. I stay around people now. I don't go into the woods anymore. I don't camp. I don't hike. I still hear tapping sometimes. Soft. Slow. But I try not to listen. I just turn on all the lights and wait for morning. It was late September when I decided to head out to the mountains alone for a short break. I had taken some time off work, and I wanted to get away from the noise of the city. Life had been hectic for months, and I just needed a few days where I didn't have to think about anything. I wasn't planning anything special, just a quiet trip to a small cabin I had rented through an old outdoors magazine listing. The place was in northern Idaho, tucked deep in the woods about a mile off a rough gravel road. I packed enough supplies for a week. Canned food, bottled water, a sleeping bag, my old .30-06 rifle for safety, a couple of good flashlights, and a cooler with a few things that needed to stay cold. I also brought a gas stove, firewood, and a few basic tools. I had no intention of seeing anyone while I was there. That was the whole point. No phone signal, no internet. Just me, the woods, and a cabin. The drive there took longer than I expected. I hit some construction and got turned around a couple of times, and by the time I made it up the final gravel road, the sun was already dipping behind the ridge. The cabin itself was smaller than it looked in the pictures, but it seemed solid. 1 room, a loft bed, a small wood stove, and a covered front porch. No electricity, no plumbing. The outhouse was about 50 feet behind the cabin, near the edge of the tree line. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It smelled like old pine and smoke, like it had been sealed up for months. There was dust on everything, but nothing seemed broken or out of place. I set my things down and opened a couple of windows to air it out. The evening air was crisp and cool, and a breeze moved through the trees outside. I heard nothing but birds and the soft creaking of the forest. It was peaceful. That first night, I lit a fire in the wood stove and heated up some canned stew. I sat on the small porch with a blanket wrapped around me and watched the last bit of daylight disappear. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars, no people, no lights in the distance. Just trees. Darkness came quickly, and by 8:30, it felt like midnight. I read for a bit by flashlight and then climbed into the loft bed and tried to sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up to a sound. A thump. Just once. It was distant, maybe outside. I froze for a moment, heart beating faster. But I didn't hear it again. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or maybe something knocked over by the wind. I stayed still and listened. Nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning was foggy and cold. I made instant coffee on the gas stove and stepped outside to stretch my legs. I checked around the cabin. Everything looked fine. I walked out to the edge of the clearing to get a better look at the forest. It was thick with underbrush and pines. I thought about hiking a little, but I wasn't familiar with the trails in this area, and I didn't want to get lost, so I stayed close. Around noon, I chopped some firewood. There was already a pile stacked against the side of the cabin, but I figured I might as well add to it. I kept busy with small things, clearing out cobwebs, checking for leaks, sweeping the floor. By afternoon, the sky started to darken again, and it looked like rain was coming. So I went back inside and got the fire going early. That night, just after I lay down, I heard the thump again. This time it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling. It was a solid, deliberate thud. It sounded like it came from the direction of the outhouse. I sat up, straining to hear. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no wind, just silence. I waited maybe 10 minutes before getting out of bed and going downstairs. I grabbed the flashlight and the rifle even though I felt silly. I opened the front door slowly and stepped onto the porch. My breath showed in the beam of the flashlight. I scanned the clearing. Nothing. I swept the light toward the trees, the outhouse. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I walked a slow circle around the cabin, listening. There was nothing unusual. No tracks, no sign of an animal. After a few minutes, I went back inside and locked the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night. By the third day, I felt on edge. I hadn't seen a soul since I arrived. I kept thinking about that thumping noise. It hadn't rained after all, but the sky was still heavy and gray. I decided to hike a little further that afternoon. Maybe it would clear my head. I packed a small bag with water, a knife, and a first aid kit and followed a faint path I had spotted earlier near the outhouse. The trail was narrow and barely visible in places, overgrown with ferns and dead leaves. After about half an hour of walking, I came to a small creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I sat down and ate a protein bar, listening to the water and the wind in the trees. It was peaceful again. I stayed there a while before turning back. On the way back to the cabin, I noticed something that hadn't been there before: a set of footprints. They were faint but noticeable in the softer patches of dirt. Not mine, too big. I hadn't seen them earlier. They looked fresh. My stomach turned. I followed them for a bit until they veered off into the trees. When I got back to the cabin, I double-checked that I had locked the door before leaving. Nothing inside looked touched, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat up with the rifle close, listening. Every creak in the cabin, every gust of wind, made my heart race. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the thumping again, closer this time, and this time it repeated. 2 thumps, then silence. I didn't go outside. I stayed by the window, staring into the dark, but I couldn't see anything. The first light, I went out. I looked around the cabin. This time, I found something. Near the woodpile, there were muddy boot prints. Just a few, leading away toward the trees. I didn't feel safe anymore. I considered leaving, but the road back down was rough and I was tired. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe someone had wandered through. A hunter, maybe, but it felt wrong. Like someone was playing with me. I stayed inside most of that day. I kept the rifle close. I checked the windows, the doors, the locks. That evening, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want the light drawing attention. I sat in the dark, listening. Just after midnight, the thumping started again. This time it came from the side of the cabin. Then the back. Then the front. 3 separate thumps, like someone circling the building. I held my breath. Whoever it was didn't try the door. They didn't speak, just thumped. Then nothing. I didn't sleep. I watched the windows until dawn. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed everything quickly, loading the truck before the sun was fully up. As I came around the back of the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Carved into the wooden siding, near the base of the wall, were words, deep and ragged, like they'd been scratched with a knife. "Stay quiet." That was it. I didn't stop to think. I got in the truck and drove. I didn't look back. The drive down was rough and I had to stop a couple of times for my nerves. When I got back to town, I checked into a cheap motel and stayed there for the night. I didn't sleep well, but I felt safer. I never reported what happened. I didn't know what to say. There was no one to identify, no damage beyond the carvings, no real crime, just fear. I never went back to that cabin, never even looked it up again. I deleted the listing and threw away the directions. It's been almost 2 years now. I still think about it sometimes. I don't go into the woods alone anymore. I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear a thump outside the window, but nothing ever followed me home. And that's enough. I'm safe, I think. I needed to get away from everything for a while. Work was nonstop. The The noise of the city felt like it was always under my skin, and even when I was home, I couldn't really relax. So I booked a week off and found a cabin listed online. It was about 4 hours from where I lived, buried deep in the woods of northern Idaho, far enough from town that I wouldn't hear a single engine or siren. The drive up there was pretty uneventful. I took my time, stopped for gas and snacks, and kept to the back roads after the interstate ended. The last hour was all winding forest roads, packed dirt with tall pines leaning in from both sides. It was beautiful but quiet in a way that made me feel like I was being swallowed by the woods. I got there in the late afternoon. The cabin was old but clean. It was a single-story place with a covered porch, a stone chimney, and one of those metal roofs that rattle when the wind picks up. Inside, it was simple. One bedroom, a living room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a bathroom. No TV, no internet, just a radio and a stack of dusty old books. It was exactly what I needed. The first night was peaceful. I made a simple dinner, canned soup and crackers, then sat on the porch and watched the trees sway as the sun went down. The stars came out one by one until the sky was full of them, so many more than I could ever see from the city. When I went to bed, the only sound was the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. The second day, I went for a hike, following a narrow trail that started behind the cabin and wound through the woods. I brought a small pack with water, snacks, and a flashlight just in case. The forest felt untouched. I didn't see another person, no signs of other hikers, not even footprints. Felt like I had stepped back in time. The quiet was thick, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call. I hiked for a couple of hours before turning back. When I got back, I read for a while, cooked a small meal, and fell asleep easily. The third day is when things started to feel strange. It started in the morning. I went outside to bring in some wood for the stove, and I noticed what looked like a footprint in the dirt near the edge of the trees. Just one. At first, I figured it might have been mine from yesterday, but it was facing toward the cabin, and I didn't remember standing in that spot. It was faint but clear enough to see the heel and the ball of the foot. No tread like a boot, more like a bare foot. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal. I didn't let it get to me. That night, I had trouble sleeping. It wasn't that I was scared. I just felt watched, like someone was nearby, standing just out of sight. I kept the bedroom window open a crack for air, and at some point after midnight, I thought I heard movement outside. Not animals rustling through the leaves. It sounded heavier, more deliberate. I stayed still in bed, listening. After a minute, it stopped. I didn't look outside. I don't know why. Something about it felt wrong. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. Nothing was missing or moved. But when I went to the back, I saw something that stopped me cold. There were marks on the window, like someone had pressed their fingers against the glass. 5 long smudges, side by side. Not prints, more like streaks, like someone had slowly dragged their hand down. Could have been condensation or dirt, but it didn't look like that. It looked fresh. I cleaned it off and told myself it was nothing. That evening, I decided not to use the wood stove. I kept the lights off and just used a flashlight to move around inside. I didn't want to make it easy for anyone out there to see me. I sat by the window watching the woods. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement. Branches shifting, something ducking between trees. I stayed up late, but nothing happened. The next few days were more of the same. I kept finding little things. A small rock placed on the porch that hadn't been there before. A stick leaned against the door like it had been set there carefully. I stopped hiking. I didn't go far from the cabin at all. I kept the axe by the door and carried the flashlight everywhere, even during the day. The feeling of being watched never left. It got worse. On the 5th night, I barely slept. I heard something around 3 in the morning. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful. Then the soft creak of the wooden boards, like someone shifting their weight. I held my breath. The steps stopped outside the front door. Then nothing. No knock. No movement. Just silence. I sat in bed, holding the flashlight like a weapon until the sun came up. That morning, I opened the door and saw the porch was empty, but the axe I kept by the door was gone. Just gone. I hadn't moved it. I searched around the cabin, looked in the bushes, walked to the edge of the trees. Nothing. I felt panic rising in my chest. Someone had been there. Someone had taken it. I packed everything right after that. I threw my gear into the back of my SUV, locked the cabin behind me, and started the drive out. But about 15 minutes down the dirt road, I realized I was almost out of gas. I'd planned to refill in town when I left, but I'd waited too long. There was no signal, no houses. I turned around and went back to the cabin, thinking I'd stay one more night and head out first thing in the morning. When I got back, the cabin door was wide open. I stopped the SUV in the driveway and just sat there for a long time. My heart was pounding. I hadn't left it open. I knew I hadn't. I hadn't even gone back inside after locking it. The windows were intact. Nothing looked broken. I finally got out and approached slowly. The door wasn't damaged, just ajar. I pushed it open with the flashlight. Inside, nothing looked different, but I could feel it. Someone had been in there. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the SUV with the doors locked. I kept the flashlight in one hand and a tire iron in the other. Every sound made me jump. Twigs snapping, wind brushing against the glass. Even my own breathing sounded too loud. I kept looking out the windows, watching the trees. A few times I thought I saw a shape standing far off, just beyond the reach of the headlights, never moving. When morning came, I drove out without looking back. I made it to a gas station after coasting on fumes for the last few miles. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to talk. Just kept driving until I hit the city. I never went back to that cabin. I never even reported it. What would I have said? That someone was leaving rocks on my porch and stealing my axe? That I heard footsteps? There was no proof. Nothing taken, nothing broken. But I know what I felt. And I know I wasn't alone out there. Even now, months later, I still think about it. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left. If I'd opened the door that night when the footsteps stopped. If I'd walked into the woods to find whoever was watching me. But I didn't, and maybe that's why I'm still here. Sometimes, I wake up at night and think I hear those footsteps again. Just for a second. Just a creak of the floorboards or a tap on the window. And I remind myself, I'm not in that cabin anymore. I'm home. I'm safe. At least I think I am. It was late October when I decided to take some time off work and get away from the city. I was tired of the noise, the traffic, and the constant pressure of deadlines. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere isolated, somewhere I could breathe and maybe sleep through a night without waking up to car horns or the sound of people yelling outside my apartment. After a bit of searching, I found a listing online for a small rental cabin deep in the woods of northern Michigan. It looked simple, nothing fancy, but it had a fireplace, a small kitchen, a decent bed, and a good amount of privacy. That was all I wanted. The drive up was long, over 6 hours with a few stops, but I didn't mind. I took back roads after the highway ended and drove through a winding trail that seemed to go on forever. The trees were changing colors, and the air felt cold and clean. It was almost dark by the time I reached the place. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by trees that blocked most of the sky. There was a small clearing around it, just big enough to park and walk around, but otherwise it felt like it was swallowed by the forest. I didn't see another soul on the way in. No neighbors, no lights, nothing but the sound of wind moving through the trees. I unpacked quickly and lit the fireplace using the small stack of wood inside. The heat kicked in fast, and soon the cabin felt warm and safe. I had brought some simple groceries and spent the evening eating canned soup and reading an old paperback I found on the shelf. There was no phone service, and the satellite Wi-Fi was too weak to load much, which I figured was probably a good thing. I wanted to disconnect anyway. By 10, I was in bed. It was dead quiet outside. No bugs, no birds, just the wind again, sometimes stronger, brushing up against the windows and the roof. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up once or twice but drifted back to sleep easily. The second day was peaceful. I took a walk through the woods with my jacket zipped up to my chin, stepping through fallen leaves and soaking up the silence. Felt good to be away. That night, I built another fire, sat by it for a while, then went to bed around the same time. But that night, something woke me. It wasn't loud. It was actually the opposite, too quiet. I opened my eyes and sat up in bed. The fire had burned down to embers. The air felt colder than before. I couldn't hear the wind anymore. I listened closely and felt a kind of tension in the silence. I don't know how else to describe it. Felt like something was out there. I stayed in bed, staring at the window across from me. After a few minutes, I started to feel stupid. Just my brain playing tricks on me. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The small pile of firewood I left by the front door was scattered. Not all of it, but enough to notice. A few pieces were lying several feet away. I thought maybe an animal had knocked them over during the night. I didn't hear anything, but I figured it could have been a raccoon or something. Still, I stacked the wood again and moved some of it inside. I spent that day hiking a bit deeper into the woods, following an old logging trail I had found on a paper map inside the cabin. The trail curved and rose through hills, eventually opening to a small, frozen-over creek. It was quiet, peaceful, and untouched. I sat there for a long while, eating a sandwich and just listening. I didn't see any other people or animals, just birds and trees. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something else. The back door, one I hadn't even used, was unlocked. Not open, but definitely unlocked. I was sure I had checked all the doors when I arrived. It was something I always did. I locked it and double-checked the front door too. That night, I put a small chair in front of the back door, just in case. Again, I told myself I was being paranoid. The cold and silence were getting to me. The third night was worse. I woke up around 2 a.m. and immediately felt something was wrong. The chair I had placed in front of the back door was knocked over. I didn't hear it fall. I don't know when it happened. I got up slowly, heart pounding, and walked to the back of the cabin. The door was still closed, locked too, but the chair was lying sideways like it had been pushed. I looked out the window but saw nothing, just pitch-black forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in a chair by the fire, which I kept going until morning. Every creak and crack in the wood made me jump. I didn't hear anyone. I didn't see anything, but I knew someone had been there. The tension in my chest didn't go away. The next morning, I made a decision to leave early. I started packing my things quickly. I didn't feel safe, but when I stepped outside, I saw something that froze me. On the side of the cabin, etched into the wood just below the window, were 3 long scratches. Not like an animal clawing at it, but more like someone dragging something sharp in a straight line. They were too clean to be natural. I felt like I was being watched. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept turning around while loading my car. At one point, I thought I saw movement deeper in the woods, but I couldn't be sure. Just shadows between trees. I started the car and backed out fast. I didn't look back. Not until I hit the main road. I drove straight back home that day. No stops. My hands were shaking on the wheel the whole time. I kept checking the rearview mirror even though there was nothing behind me. When I finally reached my apartment and locked the door, I didn't sleep for 2 nights. My head kept going back to that chair, those scratches, the silence. A week later, I emailed the owner of the cabin, just asking if anyone else had ever experienced anything weird there. He never replied. The listing disappeared a few days after that. I never went back to the woods after that trip. I canceled every hiking plan I had for the rest of the year. Something about that place wasn't right. I don't know if someone was messing with me, if there was some unspoken local issue, or if I just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I've never felt fear like that before. Not the kind that you can see or hear. The kind that lives in the quiet, in the corners of a room, in the shift of a shadow when you're sure you're alone. I went to that cabin looking for silence and peace. What I found was that silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's hiding something. I still have the paper map I brought home with me. Sometimes I pull it out and trace the trail I walked. I wonder if anyone else has taken that path. I wonder if anyone else stayed in that cabin after me. And more than anything, I wonder what would have happened if I stayed one more night. I'm glad I didn't. I don't go up into the mountains anymore. Not alone, not with friends, not with anyone, not even for the day. It's not because I had some supernatural experience or anything like that. I'm not scared of ghosts or monsters, but I am scared of people, especially the ones you don't see coming. This all happened about 6 years ago when I was 32. I needed to get away from the city for a bit. Work had been draining me. I wasn't sleeping much, and I felt like I couldn't breathe with all the noise and motion of downtown traffic, sirens, and people packed into every corner of space. So I rented a cabin up in the northern hills of Idaho, maybe a 5-hour drive from where I lived. The place was listed as a simple hunting cabin. No Wi-Fi, no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove, a water pump about 100 feet from the door, and a small outhouse a few steps behind it. That was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no notifications, just trees and silence. The listing said it was at the end of a narrow dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. I liked that even more. It meant nobody would be nearby. I packed basic gear: a propane stove, a sleeping bag, clothes, food for a week, a solar lantern, some books, and my hunting rifle just in case I came across any wildlife I didn't want to meet up close. I left early on a Tuesday morning to avoid weekend traffic and made the trip in one straight shot, stopping only once for gas and snacks. The drive up the mountain was beautiful: endless pine trees, tall peaks in the distance, and that cool, clean air you forget exists when you've been in the city too long. The dirt road that led to the cabin was easy to miss. I nearly drove past it before realizing my GPS had gone out and I'd already passed the last gas station 30 minutes ago. I backed up, turned onto the road, and drove slowly, trying not to bottom out on the uneven ruts. The road felt like it hadn't been used in years, just like the listing said. Bushes scratched against the sides of my SUV and I had to dodge fallen branches a few times. After maybe 20 minutes of slow driving, the road dead-ended into a small clearing with the cabin sitting at the far edge. It was smaller than I expected, with weathered wooden walls and a sloped tin roof. One small window near the front and a heavy-looking wooden door. The place looked abandoned, but in a charming way. I parked, got out, stretched, and immediately noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, not even insects buzzing. Just pure silence. It was unnerving for a second, but I chalked it up to arriving in the middle of the day. Animals were probably just resting. I brought my gear inside. The cabin was one room with a small table, a wood stove in the corner, and a single bed against the far wall. Everything was clean enough. Someone had swept recently. The logs stacked next to the stove looked dry. I spent the first day just settling in. Collected some water from the pump, which groaned and squeaked but still worked. Set up my sleeping bag, got the stove working, and had a quiet dinner of canned stew. I read a few chapters of a paperback and fell asleep before the sun even set. I was tired. The second day was more of the same. I walked around the woods near the cabin, made sure I was aware of my surroundings in case I needed to find my way back from farther out. The forest was thick and dense. I didn't go too far. Spent the afternoon chopping wood and stacking it just to keep myself busy. Ate another canned meal and went to bed early. But that night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. It was faint, a shuffle of leaves, maybe a crunch of a twig. I sat up and listened. It wasn't a bear. Bears move heavier, make more noise. This was quieter. I grabbed the rifle and sat in the dark, listening for a while. Whatever it was didn't come closer. Eventually, I chalked it up to a deer and went back to sleep. On the third day, I noticed something strange when I stepped outside in the morning. There were footprints, bare footprints, human, leading around the side of the cabin and stopping at the window, then back out toward the woods. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it. They looked fresh. The toes had clear imprints, like someone had been walking barefoot through the woods and stopped to look inside. I felt my stomach drop. Nobody was supposed to be out here. The nearest town was over 40 miles away. My phone had no signal, and I hadn't seen another car on the road up. I walked around the area, checked the tree line, listened for anything. It was quiet again. I told myself maybe it was just a lost hiker, maybe even an old print I missed the day before. I spent most of that day on edge, keeping my rifle within reach. I didn't see or hear anything else. That night, I locked the cabin door and pushed the table against it. I barely slept. Every sound outside made my heart race. I felt stupid for letting my imagination run away, but those footprints weren't in my head. Someone had been here. Someone came right up to the window. The fourth morning, I made a decision to leave early. I packed up most of my gear and loaded it back into the SUV. Just the essentials remained inside. I planned to leave the next morning first thing. I wanted one more night just to rest before the drive back. But when I went to check the pump for more water, I found something else. Tied to the handle was a strip of cloth, dark green, frayed at the ends, like it had been torn from a shirt. It hadn't been there yesterday. My stomach turned. This wasn't some lost hiker. Someone was messing with me. I stayed inside the cabin the rest of the day. Rifle loaded, doors locked. I didn't eat. I sat and listened. And again, around 2 a.m., I heard movement. Closer this time. I stayed perfectly still, watching the window, and I saw something. Just for a second, a shape moving past the glass. Slow, careful, like it was trying not to be seen. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Eventually, the sounds faded. I stayed up until sunrise, then grabbed my last bag and got ready to leave. When I stepped outside, something was different. My SUV was covered in long, muddy streaks. Across the windshield, the hood, the doors, like someone had dragged their hands across it. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I turned around in the clearing, I saw something on the ground. A small pile of rocks, stacked in a neat little tower, right behind the cabin, that hadn't been there before. I didn't wait around. I drove down that dirt road faster than I should have. Branches scraped the sides of the SUV, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped and checked my phone. No signal still, but I kept driving. It wasn't until I reached a gas station an hour later that I finally calmed down. I never found out who that person was or what they wanted. I never called the police. I just didn't see the point. They would have told me the same thing. No crime was committed. No one was hurt. But I know what I saw. I know someone was out there, watching me, messing with me. I went back to work, tried to forget about it, but I still think about it more often than I like. The footprints, the cloth, the smudges on the glass. Now I always make sure I'm never alone in the woods, and I never go back to any place that remote. That trip was supposed to help me relax. Instead, it reminded me how far away help really is when you're out there on your own. That cabin's probably still sitting there. Same clearing, same dirt road, same quiet woods. But I'll never go back. I don't need to, because I learned something important. Nature isn't what you should be afraid of. It's the people hiding in it that you never hear coming. I never used to be the type of person who needed to get away from everything. But that year, I just felt like I had to disappear for a bit. My job had been eating away at me. I was going through a breakup, and the city noise never seemed to stop. I wanted silence, trees, the smell of old wood, and maybe some cold wind sneaking in through a crack in a window. I found a small cabin listed online that was available for a full week, way out near a place I'd never heard of in northern Minnesota. It was cheap, old-looking, and alone. That was exactly what I needed. It took me nearly 8 hours to get there from my apartment. The last 2 hours were on roads with no names, just numbers, and even those started to fade into dirt tracks with grass pushing through the middle. My car bottomed out once. The GPS gave up eventually, so I just relied on the printed directions. Trees grew thicker on both sides, and there was a moment where I wondered if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. But just when I was about to give up and reverse down the narrow path, the trees opened up to a clearing. There it was. The cabin was small, square, and made from old gray wood. The roof slanted under the weight of time. The windows were small and clouded over, and a stone chimney poked out of one side. A narrow porch creaked under my boots when I walked up to the door. The key had been left under a rock near the steps, just like the listing said. When I opened the door, I was hit with that smell I'd wanted. Dust, wood, something a little moldy. It wasn't fancy. One room with a cot, a fireplace, a small kitchen area with an old fridge and a two-burner stove. No cell service, no TV, no radio. There was a little shed about 20 yards out back, almost buried in leaves. I unpacked quickly. Just a duffel bag with clothes, a few cans of food, a flashlight, a hunting knife, just in case, and a few books. I stacked some wood that had been left inside by the fireplace and lit it. The place warmed up quickly. I sat on the edge of the cot, watching the flames, breathing slower than I had in months. I didn't do much that first night, just listened to the wind press against the walls and crack its knuckles in the trees. The second day, I walked around the woods nearby. The leaves were mostly down, dry and loud under my boots. I saw a deer about 30 feet away, standing still and watching me. We looked at each other for a while until it turned and walked into the trees like I wasn't important. Felt good. I felt invisible out there in a good way. By the third day, I started noticing things. Small things at first. I thought I heard crunching leaves outside the window after I went to bed, but figured it was just animals. The wind blew hard that night and woke me up around 3 a.m. The fire was out, so the cabin was cold. I got up to put more wood in. That's when I noticed the back door was unlocked. I always locked it before bed. Always. The next day, I checked everything more carefully. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, even looked inside the shed. It was just full of old tools and rusted things I didn't understand. A broken wheelbarrow, some gas cans. Nothing weird. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I chalked it up to being alone and jumpy. My brain was probably still used to the stress of work and traffic and people everywhere. It would pass. On the fourth night, I woke up again. This time not from the cold. Something had hit the side of the cabin. A dull thud, like someone dropped something heavy against the wall. I sat up in the cot, listening. There was nothing. I grabbed the flashlight, turned it on, and walked slowly to the back door. I opened it and stepped out. The air was freezing and sharp. I scanned the trees, the ground. Nothing. I left the light on and went back to bed, but barely slept. The fifth day, I saw footprints. They were behind the shed, near the edge of the trees. Human-sized, deep pressed into the soft dirt and leaves. I hadn't been back there since I checked the shed. My boots didn't match the tread. I followed them a little. They didn't lead anywhere, just stopped about 20 yards into the woods, like the person who made them had vanished into thin air. I went back to the cabin, locked every door, closed every curtain. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, sat up with my flashlight and the knife next to me. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not animals, not wind, definite, clear footsteps, slowly moving across the porch. Then a soft creak, the sound of a hand pushing on wood. I held my breath, then silence. Nothing happened for hours. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was coming through the window. I ran to the front door. There were smudges on the glass. Not fingerprints, just wide, smeared spots like someone had pressed their face against it. I opened the door and checked the ground. More footprints, just like before. They went around the cabin. Same tread, same direction. They never led away, just around. I decided I was leaving the next morning. That day, I packed up everything. I didn't want to drive those roads at night, so I planned to sleep one more time and get up at first light. I kept everything ready to go. I moved the cot in front of the door. I didn't care about the floor. I wanted a barrier between me and whoever was out there. I didn't light a fire that night. I didn't want to give them light to see. It was the coldest night of my life. I stayed under all the blankets with my knife in hand, listening. Every tiny crack of wood, every sigh of wind, I noticed it all. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, this time slower, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard them. They circled the cabin. I heard a tapping on the glass in the kitchen. Just one tap every few seconds. Then silence. Then 3 taps faster. Then nothing. Couldn't move. I was shaking, not from the cold. Just fear. Real, full fear. I didn't sleep at all. When the sky started turning gray, I got up, grabbed my bag and pushed the cot aside. The door hadn't been touched. No marks. Nothing. I opened it slowly and looked out. Nothing. I got in the car and started driving. I didn't look back. Not once. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone in the road behind me. Took almost 9 hours to get home. I stopped for gas once and realized I looked like hell. Pale, unshaven, eyes wide. The attendant asked if I was okay. I just nodded. I never reported anything. What would I say? That someone walked around my cabin a few times? That I heard tapping? That's not a crime. It's not proof. It's barely a story. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. About a month later, I checked the listing again. The cabin was gone. Not unavailable, just gone. The entire listing had been removed. I even tried to search the area again to find something nearby, just to see if it was still there. Nothing came up. I don't go camping anymore. I don't hike alone. I still live in the city, and sometimes, even with the traffic and the sirens, I sleep better here, because at least I know who's around me. I don't wonder what's outside my window. I don't wake up to silence. And I never, ever want to hear that sound again. The sound of slow footsteps circling a place where I'm supposed to be completely alone. I needed a break from the noise. Life had been wearing me down for a while. The job, the people, the non-stop traffic, the glowing screens, the fake smiles. I was sick of all of it. I needed somewhere quiet, somewhere where I could feel my own thoughts again. So I rented a small cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. The place was a few miles from the nearest town, and it sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road with trees so thick you couldn't see 10 feet off the road. The listing said the cabin had no Wi-Fi, no TV, and barely any phone reception. That was perfect. It was just what I wanted. It was a plain, single-story cabin with a wood stove, a small kitchenette, a cot for sleeping, and a single narrow bathroom. There was a lake about a mile downhill and nothing but forest in every other direction. I brought a few books, some food, and a notebook. I figured I'd hike, cook simple meals, sleep a lot, and try to get my head straight. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains. The air smelled of pine, cold dirt, and something dry I couldn't quite place. I parked my car behind the cabin and walked around a bit to get my bearings. The forest was thick and quiet, almost too quiet. There weren't even birds chirping. I chalked it up to the time of year. It was late fall. The leaves had mostly fallen, and the ones that remained crunched loudly under my boots. The cabin itself was clean, but very basic. It had a bolt lock and a deadbolt on the front door. There were old-fashioned latches on the 2 windows. I checked them all out of habit just to feel secure. I cooked myself a can of soup, made some tea, and sat outside on the small porch until it got too cold. Then I went inside and started a fire in the wood stove. The heat felt good. It smelled like dry cedar and ash. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. The quiet was so complete it felt like a blanket over everything. When I woke up, it was still dim outside. Morning fog drifted slowly through the trees. I made some oatmeal and coffee and took a walk down to the lake. The path was steep and covered in leaves, and I had to watch my step. The lake was small but beautiful. The surface was perfectly still. I didn't see any signs of animals. No birds, no deer, not even insects. Again, I figured it was the season. The days passed slowly. I'd wake up, eat, read, write a little, then go for a walk in the woods. I stayed away from going too deep, though. The trees were thick, and it was easy to lose your sense of direction. There weren't any marked trails. Still, I felt like I was slowly starting to breathe again. My shoulders weren't so tight. I was sleeping better. The quiet was healing. But around the 3rd night, I noticed something strange. Right before I went to bed, I was sitting near the fire, reading one of my books, when I thought I heard something outside. It was just a quick sound, like a snap or a crunch. I froze, listening. The forest was quiet again. I figured maybe a branch fell or a squirrel ran across some dead leaves. I let it go and went to bed. The next morning, I found something odd. Near the back corner of the cabin, the leaves were disturbed. It looked like someone had walked there. At first, I thought maybe it had been me and I forgot, but the pattern was strange. The prints were small but not animal-like, more like bare feet. The ground was hard, so there weren't perfect impressions, just areas where the leaves had been shifted. I stood there staring at it for a while before brushing it off. Maybe a raccoon or something, I told myself. That night, I locked everything carefully and went to bed. I didn't sleep as well. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something, a creak, a thump, but every time I sat up, it was silent again. I told myself it was the wind and the old wood of the cabin. The next day, I walked farther than I had before. I went past the lake and followed a shallow, dry creek bed for a while. The forest was thick. I kept stopping to look behind me. I don't know why, just a feeling. When I turned back, I realized I'd wandered farther than I meant to. I couldn't see the lake anymore. For a second, panic hit me, but I took a deep breath and retraced my steps carefully. It took longer than I expected, but I found my way back. When I got to the cabin, something was off. The front door was closed, but it wasn't locked. I was sure I had locked it. I stood there staring at the doorknob. Then I checked the windows. The one on the left side of the cabin had the latch slightly open, just a little. I hadn't opened any windows since I arrived. Inside, nothing looked touched. My things were still there. The books were where I left them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I checked the cupboards, the bathroom, even under the cot. Nothing. I sat down and tried to calm down. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it. Maybe I hadn't closed the window latch properly. That night, I kept the hatchet by the bed. I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A soft sound, something brushing against the side of the cabin. Then it was quiet. I held my breath. I didn't move. The fire was down to coals. The air felt colder than it should have. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I found more disturbed leaves behind the cabin. A wider path this time. Something or someone had walked around the back. I saw a few more of those partial prints. They were too big to be an animal and too human to ignore. I felt a tightness in my chest. I packed my things, got in the car, and drove into town. I bought a trail camera and some heavy-duty locks. I drove back, set up the camera facing the side of the cabin where the prints had been, and reinforced the door and windows. I didn't want to leave. I told myself I was overreacting. That night, it rained. Hard. The sound on the roof was constant, and I couldn't sleep again. I thought maybe the rain would wash away whoever or whatever had been creeping around. The next morning, I checked the camera. The camera had 3 photos taken at 3:17 a.m. The first was blurry. The second showed a vague figure near the window. The third was clearer. A man, shirtless, thin, pale. He had his face pressed against the glass. His eyes were wide open, and he was smiling. I stared at that photo for a long time, couldn't breathe. I took the camera, got in my car, and left. I drove straight to town and showed the photo to the sheriff's department. They took me seriously. They said they'd send someone to check the area, but the forest was huge. They didn't find anyone. They said maybe it was a transient or someone living off-grid. I didn't go back. I called the cabin owner, told them I had to cut the rental short, and offered to pay for the full stay anyway. They didn't ask many questions. I went home and didn't talk about it for a while. I still have that photo. I keep it in a drawer. I've thought about deleting it, but I can't bring myself to. It reminds me that even out in the middle of nowhere, you're never really alone. I lock my windows now, every night, even in the city. I check them twice. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will.